Hello, everyone. We'll wait just a minute or two till all the audience members enter the conference, and then we'll begin. We'll begin in just a moment. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Danny Avron. I'm the Executive Director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights at the Hebrew University's Faculty of Law. On behalf of our Academic Director, Dr. Annette Albin, and our colleagues here at the Center, I'm very happy to welcome you to the 16th Annual Minerva Conference on International Humanitarian Law. We're proud that our center is the preeminent academic institution in Israel devoted to human rights research and education, and the hub for engagement of academia, civil society, and government on human rights issues. As reflected also in today's conference, the center places considerable emphasis on comparative research and experience and its relevance for local human rights challenges in the Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian contexts. We seek to provide our students with the tools and with a passion to fulfill key roles in society as leaders in public service, as educators and researchers, as activists and pioneers of social change, and as thoughtful, engaged, compassionate human beings. Over the years, our center has pioneered the study in Israel of a number of academic fields that had previously been underdeveloped here. Transitional justice is one such field. Child and youth rights is the most recent example, as next year, with the help of a new multi-million-dollar grant, we will be inaugurating the first academic research program and the first chair in child rights at an Israeli law school. And the call for applicants for the chair was issued just a few days ago. And of course, IHL is another such field. Professor Yuval Shani established this conference series in 2006 during his tenure as academic director of our center, at a time when IHL was not a very well-known or much studied academic field in Israel. Over the years, the series has had a real impact on the development of a robust IHL discourse in the country and has become an important annual event in the international IHL world, bringing together prominent leaders in the field, as well as young scholars and practitioners from around the world. At the risk of incurring his wrath, I'd just like to say a few words about Yuval. As you may know, he's done a few things since completing his term as academic director of our center in 2010, serving as dean of our law faculty, member and chair of the UN Human Rights Committee, vice president of research at the Israel Democracy Institute, founding director of our faculty's Center for Cyber Law, and academic director of the clinical legal programs here, to name a few, all while continuing to teach and mentor students. Throughout this time, he's remained deeply involved in the center's work, chairing our academic committee, chairing this annual conference series, serving as co-editor-in-chief of our human rights law journal, the Israel Law Review, always accessible, providing invaluable support, counsel, and friendship. So he's not leaving or anything, but I just did want to take this opportunity to thank him both personally and on behalf of everyone at the center. Before I hand it over to Yuval to introduce the themes of this year's conference, two additional very brief thanks. First, to the amazing Minerva Center staff, especially Anat Mishali, Dari Nof, and Edna Sustiel, whose dedication and hard work make it possible for us to do everything that we do, and who make working at the center such a pleasure. And of course, to all of the speakers we'll be hearing over the next 3 days. Back in the spring, we naively thought that this could be our first in-person international conference since pre-COVID, rather than an online event. That turned out to be logistically impossible, so thank you for sticking with us and participating from so many different locations and time zones. We hope to host you in person in Jerusalem soon. Note to the audience, you're welcome to submit questions in writing during the presentations using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, one quick note about a couple of upcoming events of ours. On November 25th, we'll be hosting an online symposium with Dr. Lucas Lishinsky and a terrific lineup of international speakers to discuss Lucas's new book on cultural heritage law and the shaping of transitional justice. And for the Hebrew speakers among you, on December 8th, we'll be hosting an in-person discussion on campus with Israeli Supreme Court Justice Professor Daphne Barak Erez on the Supreme Court and social rights. Notices and registration details for both events will be going out in the next few days. So thank you all. We look forward to a terrific 3 days of discussions. Yuval?
Thank you, Danny. Thank you also for the personal and somewhat called for introduction regarding myself. But anyway, I'm glad to be here for the 16th annual IHL conference. This is the second consecutive and hopefully the last conference that we will be holding online as opposed to physically, so this is regrettable on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some advantages of having conferences online, and one of the advantages is being able to access a very impressive lineup of all-star IHL speakers with vast experience and reputation in the field. We are also pleased to combine them with a very impressive and talented group of young and upcoming speakers who are presenting their own original and stimulating papers. So we feel that in some respects, I mean, working from afar has been also an asset. We're particularly proud this year to have been able to assemble some continent a very diverse group of speakers, and it has a significant diversity in terms of background. I mean, we have many academics, but we also have a very good number of practitioners on board. The topic for this year's conference, the title for this year's side in Evaluating IHL from Other Normative Perspectives, and the underlying assumption that we had when we formulated the invitation for the conference is that the interpretation law in general and IHL in particular often depends on background norms and normative commitments of different target audiences, which may include ideas about morality or more social norms, other legal norms from non-IHL fields, commitment to religious ideals, to cultural norms, etc., and that engaging with with these norms and understanding their significance for the users of IHL and for the audience of IHL may throw and taught and conceived, and that this external yet related perspective may explain some of the more spectacular successes and failures of the field. And we're very pleased that the response that we've had to the call for papers and also to some direct invitations has enabled us to address these sort of issues from a very rich variety of perspectives. We will start the conference momentarily with a keynote, Naz Modirzadeh from Harvard, who will personal perspective on how IHL is practiced from the viewpoint of a practitioner. Then we are going to move to, in the second panel of the day, we are going to move to discussing how IHL morality and emotional normativity And finally, for today, we will be speaking about the role of human rights theory and doctrine and morality as much as it is represented in theory and doctrine in shaping the practice of IHL. Tomorrow, we will be moving to discuss the role of media and so be taking an interesting perspective on some of specific historical episodes close to home in which the strategics and politics of war have led to shaped the practice of IHL. We'll also discuss the trade-offs. We will launch tomorrow Sam Moyn's book, and Humane, a thought-provoking and quite provocative book, which offers interesting perspectives on trade-offs between the humanitarian project and IHL. And finally, in the final day of the conference, we would also hear a presentation, a closing presentation by Helen Durham from the ICRC on the different stories that we are telling ourselves on IHL. So we have a very rich and complex program addressing IHL from a variety of external perspectives. And I'm certain that we would be, that we're in for a real intellectual and professional treat. Before I close and hand it over to the speakers in the first panel, I do wish to thank my colleagues on the organizing committee, David Kretschmer, Tomer Brody, Yael Ronen, Einat Ronen, and Einat Albin, sorry, and Danny Evron, for engaging with me in the formulation of the call for papers, in selection of papers, and in issuing the invitation. And I also want to thank the Minerva team, especially Danny, Anat Mishali, and Dari Nof, who's responsible for the online environment in which we operate, for their hard work in making this possible. I also want to acknowledge the presence of our friends from the ICRC Tel Aviv team here, Stefan and Maya, who've been very supportive and have helped us to augment the conference and address some of the perspectives that we needed some beefing up on, and also in chairing panels. So I think that without further ado, I will pass the floor to Stefano Gida from the ICRC Tel Aviv mission to introduce the keynote speaker and the other panelists and to kick off the discussion. So I wish us all a very productive and fruitful conference. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon or good morning or good evening or good night. Anyway, welcome to all of you to this first session. I will kindly ask my partners, Naz and Pnina, to open their camera if possible. I can see you, Pnina. Maybe Naz, if you could start. Yeah, you're here. So welcome to this first session. Thank you to the introductory words from Danny and Yuval. And it's my pleasure today to chair this 1 hour with Naz and Pnina. They do not really need introductions, but let me say a few words about Naz, who is joining us, I think, from Harvard. She's a professor of practice at Harvard Law School. She's a founding director of the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflicts. And she's going to talk to us for about 25 minutes based on a famous article written end of 2020 called Cut These Words, Passion and International Law of War Scholarship, which is the same title of a presentation. I encourage you to check also the website of the PILAC website, where you will find a lot of interesting and fascinating pieces. And Naz is also a regular host and speaker at the Crisis Group podcast, Hold Your Fire, which is also very, very interesting. Commenting with me after Naz's presentations, there will be Colonel Pnina Sharvit-Bachor, with whom I had the pleasure to interact years ago when she was heading the International Law Department of the Israel Defense Forces. And now Pnina is a senior researcher associate and head of Law and National Security Program at the Institute for National and Security Studies, INSS. And I encourage you as well to check their website, which entails a lot of fascinating pieces, including various PNAS contributions to this website. So as I told you, in terms of agenda, we will start with 25 minutes, more or less, with Naz, and I will wave my hand like this to tell Naz we are reaching 5 minutes before the end. It will be followed by comments by Pnina and myself for about 15 minutes max. Then we will give back the floor to Naz to answer our comments or our questions. And of course, throughout the presentation of Naz, you have the possibility on your screen with the Q&A function to ask questions, and I will select them. Hopefully we'll have time to address all of them, but it's possible, and I apologize in advance that we will not be able to address all of them. But without any further ado, I will kindly give the floor to Naz for your presentation. Thank you, Naz.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you to the team and Professor Shani and Evran. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be with my old friend, Stefan Ojeda. It's a real pleasure to join all of you, and thank you for having me. As Stefan said, I'm going to take about 25 minutes to talk about this paper, Cut These Words, and reflect a bit on what you've all told us is the purpose of our being together these days, to think about the opinions, concerns, and impulses that we bring to our work, as well as the question of whose voices are heard and listened to in the field of international humanitarian law when we discuss the role of law in war. So let me give the quote that gave rise to the title of the paper from Ralph Waldo Emerson. It is, he is never dull, never insincere, and has the genius to make the reader care for all that he cares for. The sincerity and marrow of the man reaches to his sentences. Cut these words and they would bleed. He's referring there to the essayist Montaigne. So I'll give a few words about how I came to this project. It was a sense I had, particularly in being a practitioner and a scholar during the armed conflict in Syria, and particularly as that conflict became more and more immiserating for the Syrian population, involved more and more states and non-state actors. And I was attending conferences and workshops involving military lawyers, scholars, humanitarian and human rights practitioners. And I increasingly had the feeling that something was amiss with the way we were discussing international law and war, that something was wrong with the way that we were utilizing law as a prism through which to talk about armed conflict and the experiences of people living through armed conflict. I turned to a document that I have read many times over the last years, almost as a way to kind of get myself re-engaged. It's a document that tends to make me feel very frustrated. So I thought if I could engage my anger, that would make me feel once again committed to the scholarship and the debates we were having. And that document is the 2010 Memorandum on Contemplated Lethal Operations against Anwar al-Awlaki. It's sometimes called the Targeted Killing Memorandum. It was drafted by two United States government attorneys regarding the legality of targeted killing operations against a United States citizen who was at the time in Yemen. And I found in that memorandum a citation I had not noticed before to a legal memorandum from long ago, early 1970s, regarding US military operations in Cambodia. And the argument was that the legal argument for lethal operations in Cambodia had been based on a very similar jus ad bellum claim as to the one that the US was now making to target Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, a justification that, as we now know, went on to be extensively expanded to cover so-called targeted killing operations in many countries around the world. And this led me to the scholarship that had been written by international lawyers around the Vietnam War. So a group of international legal scholars based in the United States writing during the war about their analysis of international law applicable to that armed conflict. And the more I read this scholarship and the more I both recognized so many of the debates that we are having today about the law and the use of force and the law applicable in armed conflict, the more I also had a sense that there was something fundamentally different about the scholarship written during the Vietnam era. I came to think of that something different as passion. And so I'll now say a few words about what I found and my reflections on what that means for our scholarship today. Let me just say by means of caveat that I'm very narrowly focused here. So in the paper and in the research, I'm looking at scholarship written by scholars in the mainstream, so scholars who really seem to be taking a relatively mainstream approach to international law and explicitly seeking to influence decision makers in real time. Secondly, I'm focused on scholars either writing in the US or writing from other places, but trying to speak into the US debate. So there's a tremendous amount that's left out here, and I look forward in the Q&A to discussing what might be some comparative lenses to other contexts. The question I found myself asking was a simple one. What is meaningful legal scholarship about war? Should we expect that legal scholarship written about war during a time of war should make us feel something and should make us have a sense of the soul of the author behind the scholarship that we are reading? I came to think of passionate writing and passionate legal reasoning and not being about emotions or about writing that presents the interior or personal life of the author, but rather as a kind of writing that reflects a moral situatedness, a willingness to take seriously the professional ethics and the agency of writing about international law and war for audiences that have power to make decisions about that war. I identified a series of characteristics that I thought were encompassed in the scholarship about Vietnam, and then a series of characteristics from our contemporary era, from writing from about 2010 to the present day. I'll say a few words about the characteristics I saw in what I came to think of as passionate legal reasoning, and then a few characteristics of what I think of as our current arid context. First, passionate legal reasoning during the Vietnam era took facts seriously. So by this, I mean that the writing conveyed a rich sense of the actual war that was going on, informed by the political realities affecting those who were living through armed conflict. I had a sense when I was reading these pieces that we were talking about a real place and an armed conflict that was affecting real people. Secondly, I had a sense that much of the scholarship read like a conversation. I had a sense that I was reading honest accounts of how international lawyers were grappling with the limits of their own discipline, and not always driven by a need to provide confident or watertight answers to complex questions, but willing to be humble and even vulnerable in discussing the role of law, but also the individual role of legal scholars in shaping the framing of armed conflict from a legal perspective. Finally, I found that much of the scholarship during the Vietnam era seemed to reflect a sense of the responsibility of legal scholars regarding not only their own writing about a particular legal dilemma or question, but also their responsibility for potentially influencing the way that international law on armed conflict would come to be shaped, the way future generations would understand and utilize the arguments that were crafted during the Vietnam era, a real sense of responsibility to the future for the work that they were doing. Let me say a few words about contemporary scholarship. And here I want to give an important caveat. My point here is not to name or call out specific scholars and criticize them for their writing. I myself am guilty of many of the characteristics that I found in this contemporary writing. And I'm not ascribing any kind of intentionality or ideological bent to this approach. Rather, my sense is that there is increasingly a set of unspoken rules being applied to international legal scholarship regarding the use of force and regarding international humanitarian law, and that the tone, style, and approach of academic scholarship has shifted since the Vietnam era. In my view, it has shifted for the worse, and I'll say a few words about why. So as I said, I looked at scholarship from the second half of the war on terror, whatever we think that means now in terms of temporal delineations, roughly from about 2009 to 2018. And most striking, I have to say from the outset, was a almost total lack of reference to the Vietnam era in this scholarship. I was struck by the fact that that single citation in the Al-Awlaki memorandum was one of the only references that I found to the Cambodian precedent for what was happening in the context of debates about the war on terror. Most important, perhaps, is the first characteristic I'd like to talk about, and this is the idea of reasoning through abstraction or unreality. I found that there seemed to be a number of analytical, rhetorical, and stylistic tools used by scholars to create distance. Distance between the author and the reader, distance between legal analysis and any actual armed conflict happening in the world, and distance between international law and its effects. Increasingly, this struck me as having a kind of anti-common sense effect, but also one that allowed the reader to constantly remove themselves from the context and the implications of the legal analysis they were reading. This was done through a number of particular moves. One was a widespread use of hypotheticals. So one of the things that I found is that much of the scholarship in the contemporary era would begin in the first few paragraphs by saying, this is an article about the armed conflict in Syria, or this is an article about the armed conflict in Yemen. But within a page or two, we would switch to state A, state B, armed group C, Angozia, Beta Z, and Cardassia. We all know these various terms that are used for fictional states, often in examinations that international law professors give their students. It struck me that this move served to, in many important ways, limit our understanding that the legal arguments that were being made about a real place, Syria, and about real people that would be affected by the implementation of these various legal analyses. It increasingly read as clinical, boring, and anodyne, as opposed to the incredibly evocative writing that I found in the Vietnam era. So just to give an example of this kind of writing, and again, this is merely meant to be an example, hostilities on the territory of state A between armed group C located in state B and state A represent a single NIAC between A and C without any additional IAC between A and B. I don't have to go on. I think we've all read, and many of us have written analysis like this. And increasingly, I had the sense that there is something deeply problematic about this approach. Second, I found that the mode of communication in contemporary scholarship had shifted from one of a conversation between people, between colleagues, towards a presentation, almost like a PowerPoint presentation, a sense that the job of the international lawyer or the international legal scholar was to create an analytical framework, to create tools that could be quickly utilized and applied to different armed conflicts that matched the kind of dilemmas that they were talking about. a sense that it was important to create typologies and new terms for what was happening, as though the situation was so complex and historically incomparable to any past events that we needed new words or phrases in order to understand them. This led also to a sense of what I felt was extreme presentism. And here I don't mean presentism in the professional historical sense of the term, but rather just very simply a sense that the contemporary conflict is the only time that humanity has gone through the particular challenges that the scholars were discussing. This feeling of urgency and the need to react to quickly changing facts on the ground without actually discussing those facts gave a sense that scholarship needed to be reactive, that international law quickly had to bring forward the tools in order to respond, again, to this historically unprecedented set of events. It served again to make me feel as the reader that I was not only being taken out of place, so out of Syria, out of Yemen, and into the abstract, but also out of time, that there was a sense that our shared collective responsibility to one another, our shared collective responsibility for how we utilize legal argumentation when we talk about something as high stakes as war was increasingly removed, not only from the people affected by these analyses, but even from a situatedness in real time. So I'll briefly say a word about why this might have happened and what might explain this shift if my diagnosis resonates at all with the audience. One argument that I heard from many scholars that I spoke with, and I did speak with a number of the scholars who are still with us from the Vietnam era, one explanation was that the political environment in the 1960s and 1970s was so different that it actually shaped the way scholars did their writing. So a number of the Vietnam era scholars said you would be in your office and you would look out the window and your students were protesting in the university yard. This shifted the way that you thought about the stakes of what you were working on. Second, a number of individuals raised the possibility that the draft in the United States, some 1.8 million individuals were drafted in the course of the Vietnam conflict, and that this idea that for scholars and for international lawyers, their sons could be taken off to war at any moment, their students could be taken off to war at any moment, influenced the way that they spoke and they wrote about their own discipline and about their responsibilities within that discipline. And finally, many said that the fear of all-out nuclear war that existed in the late 1960s and early 1970s may have contributed to a very different environment in which international lawyers thought, wrote, and spoke about international law and armed conflict, that they truly had a sense that our very humanity was on the line in the kinds of debates that were taking place and in the way that law was being marshaled to support different political positions in those debates. What about our own times? So some argued that the reason for this shift might be that we are in an era where the fighting itself is much more distanced. Think here of the many debates over drones, AI, technologies that allow an increasing distance between the people impacted by conflict and those that are fighting it, and certainly those making legal arguments about fighting it. Secondly, some raise the possibility that academic life itself has just dramatically changed, that empirical and quantitative methods that have been introduced into scholarly expectation, law and economics analysis, just the sheer increase in the competitiveness of academic hiring and writing has pushed scholars towards this particular mode of analysis that I was finding in our contemporary context. that the more competition there is, the more scholarship there is, perhaps the more pressure there is to come up with a new term for non-international armed conflict, or a new way of framing a conflict that might actually not be so unusual after all. So let me say a word about why this might be a good thing. So why I might be completely wrong. I think one possibility is that it's exactly in law that we want to see dispassion. It's exactly when we talk about legal analysis and the rules for the regulation of the use of force, and certainly the regulation of violence, lethal violence in armed conflict, that we want a profession that is dispassionate, that can speak of these things through analytical tools, through analogies, precisely to remove decision makers, readers, and perhaps even the public from their politicized, biased, emotional commitments during what is probably the most intense emotional experience for many in a political community, war. Secondly, it may be that the kind of writing that I'm talking about is actually bad for scholarship, that aside from whether dispassion is better for legal analysis in armed conflict, that it would lead to a kind of sticky, sort of cheesy even legal writing that we would not wish to read in the pages of journals, a kind of sentimentality that, aside from not being particularly pleasing to read, is also somewhat insulting when we think about its application in armed conflict. I'm thinking here of scholars who might perhaps wish to write about how sad they are regarding the situation of others that are being impacted by an armed conflict. So I find that I take those criticisms and those concerns seriously, but ultimately my sense is that the current approach is allowing us to not interrogate our own commitments, our own responsibilities for the work that we do, and for the law that we analyze and apply, the very thing which makes us have a voice in this debate, allows us, I think, to distance ourselves from the repercussions and the implications of the work that we are doing. My sense is that IHL, and certainly international law on the use of force, it's not itself particularly doctrinally complex. It is the morality, the ethics, and the stakes of decision-making that make our field complex and challenging. I have a sense that dryness, distance, and bloodlessness corrode over time. So it isn't just that they have a cost in the immediate context of a particular article, but over time, they affect our ability to think about law and war in a situated manner. Passionate reasoning, in my view, encourages a conversation that is more open, that is more humble, and that invites readers to reflect on the responsibilities and the morality of their own engagement with international law during wartime. I'll just read the final paragraph from the piece and then say a word about my sense of its relevance to our conversation here in these 2 days. Thank you so much, Stefan. Perfect. So the final paragraph from the piece reads, ultimately, what I felt in reading international law of war scholarship and participating in professional academic workshops during the ongoing Syrian war was that we should be ashamed of ourselves. I felt that we would not have been comfortable presenting our arguments to a room full of Syrians or to a room full of young soldiers. We would have been embarrassed to take our PowerPoint slides and our acronyms and tell a group of people affected by the war that we were focused on began with an abstract and convoluted notion of self-defense and ended with complex rules of targeting that we were not actually sure were being applied, that it had no reference to those people, to their experience of war, to our political responsibility for the war they were living through, or to our fundamental and simple sense of how international law did and should see them. We had neither a story of failure nor of justice. We had only desiccated concepts devoid of connection. I'll just close by saying I'm particularly excited that this conversation is with young scholars. I think in many ways that is my audience. My hope is not to change the way senior scholars write, but rather to invite those entering the field today both to remember why they entered this field and also to consider the possibilities of doing this work in a different way. And second, I'll say I've reflected the last few days on what all of this might mean for the context for those of you who are in Jerusalem. And I think that there is a real question about when there isn't the kind of distance that I'm talking about. So I am writing primarily about scholars who are writing from a literal distance, from a far away place, about wars happening in countries where most of them have never set foot and never will set foot. The situation is, of course, I don't need to say, very, very different for those who are meeting at the Minerva Center. And I wonder, what is the role of passionate reasoning, and what is the role of thinking about how we write and think about international law in war in a context where it is precisely the closeness, it is precisely the proximity that can often create the most profound concerns for what happens in situations of armed conflict and, of course, occupation. Thanks so much. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Naz. Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to Pnina, just a few comments on my side. Your presentation was fascinating, and as is your article, and I encourage again everybody to read it. And even though I'm not a scholar, I think it resonates with not only scholars, but also with a wider crowd, including what we call humanitarian lawyers, because we are in proximity with victims. We are on the ground witnessing the consequences of some legal and policy decisions. And that was my case for the war on terror in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo. And the funny thing, if I may say, is that all the ICRC delegates called us, because I was not there during Vietnam, called us saying, look, it looks like Vietnam. And we exchanged on a lot of legal concepts with those elder delegates who experienced the Vietnam War and the legal debates at the time. Now, one aspect is, if we focus on the war on terror, is that, and even though you take a broader definition of passion than only emotions as we usually understand, but the environment post 9/11 was so loaded, emotionally speaking, that even though ICRC, we are passionate people, we ended up publicly issuing some dispassionate writing, on purpose to a little bit not de-dramatize, but cut all the emotional aspects of the decisions taken post 9/11, while on a bilateral and confidential level, we kept the information on the fact, on the consequences, and all the passions going with that. But my question to you, Naz, would be, you highlight in your presentation in the article the scholar work of people working during the Vietnam War. What were the influence? Okay, they did not write boring articles, but what did they manage to achieve in terms of influence on policymakers, on those taking the decisions? Now, it's true that in the nowadays articles, we don't necessarily have all the analysis of the facts of the history, etc., characterizing a certain context. But at the same time, we live in an era where it's quite easy to have the facts, to reach the facts, thanks to all the technologies, thanks to the smartphones. Everybody's taking a video of what's happening. So unless distorted, you can still have access to facts. So you don't need necessarily to spend, ages explaining the whole context. I will have also a question in your article, and you raised it during your presentation, on the famous 2010 memorandum and the mystery of the absence of the Cambodia precedent. In a one footnote, you said you are going to write a follow-up piece on this. Have you done it, or are you planning to do it? When can we expect the sequel of your article? Without any further ado, I give the floor to Pnina, and right after Pnina, Naz, you can take back the floor. Please, Pnina, proceed.
Okay, so good evening to everybody, and it's great to see both Stefan and Naz, especially to see Naz from far. I must start by saying that one of the points that Naz raises in her article is that the contemporary legal writing is sometimes boring and lacks passion. And her article definitely is not boring and is full of passion, because when I got the email asking me if I want to comment on the article, and I saw 64 pages article, I said, oh, well. And then I started reading, and then I just ended up reading the whole. I just wanted to see what it is about. I found myself reading the whole article until the end without getting up. Because it was so interesting and written in a very passionate and interesting way. So you at least managed to solve that problem. And your last point was, how does it work when when you don't have the distance from the conflict, when you are involved, and in my case, even I would say in a certain way participate in the conflict, at least in the past. I was also in charge of the legal advisors, the operational legal advisors in the IDF during armed conflict situations. So it's really, I'm really a practitioner. Also, I'm not an academic. I do write articles, but it's more always from a practitioner's point of view. So when I read your article, two main points came to mind from, again, from my point of view as a practitioner more than as an academic. And the one refers to the substance of the articles you're referring to, which dealt with the legality of the use of force, or jus ad bellum, as you say now, we use the Latin. And the second point is about really the passion and the pros and cons of using passion. So with regard to the first point, and I think here you point out, when you talk, especially when you are mentioning the Vietnam era articles, so, and I will quote something that Naz wrote, you said, particularly as to international law on the use of force, Vietnam era scholars seemed clear with themselves and with their readers that there were points where law ended and their own opinions or policy preferences began. Rather than shoehorn their views into purportedly abstract legal theories, they frequently expressed to the reader a sense that international law would get them only so far. And then you go on to say, they did not appear to be driven by a sense that it was the work of international lawyers to always provide confident, watertight, neat answers to complex questions of law, politics, and warfighting. And I think what in this paragraph, I think it encompasses my view of the complexity of applying law to the jus ad bellum part of the equation, to the question of use of force, because really it is linked. I would say it's not linked, it's derived from political and geopolitical considerations. And again, from my experience, while when it came to jus in bello, to is this a target lawful or not, I was listened to. I as a legal advisor, yes, it was clear that the legal advisor has a say. When it came to jus ad bellum kind of questions, it was more on the line of, we will do what we think is right, and you will explain what we are doing. We'll let you do the explanation. And I have a feeling that that's not only the case here. That's, I think, something that is more refers to what happens also worldwide, and we see it when we have issues like humanitarian intervention, like intervening in Syria, and then there is an attempt to find the legal basis, but it is really a legal explanation, and sometimes after the fact explanation, to a decision that is derived 90%, I would say, from political considerations. And I think, and then you criticize the new era of the contemporary writing, and again, I'm quoting, you say arguments about the use of force sound less and less like arguments about intervention and invasion, which so often what they are actually about, and more like pit stops on the way to IHL. And here I think actually that I think that maybe that's a good thing, because I think IHL, or the youth in Belo, there we can make the impact, the legal advice, especially the legal academics that we, the practitioners, rely on eventually. Because there, as I said before, those are legal questions. There I can say no, yes, and they will listen to me. And when we get stuck on the jus ad bellum part of it, and we don't get, and the argument becomes, who is right and who is wrong in the conflict, both sides, of course, think that they are right and the other side is wrong, and they are the victims, and the other side is the one that is committing the aggressor. And if we stay on that level, we will not get to the level where we can have an impact. So that's one point. The second point, and I don't know how much time I have left. 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Okay, so my second point is again about passion, and you mentioned first of all the two reasons. The one is the distance, and the one is the expectations of the academic community, how to write an article. And I think here there's no distance in Israel. And when you do look internally in articles written in Hebrew, for example, some of them are really quite passionate. But when you write outside, when you write externally, I think here the main problem that I have with passionate writing is that it's very difficult to be taken seriously when you're too passionate, not because of what you mentioned, that I might seem too emotional and not serious enough, but because it immediately relates to being biased, to being, if I write passionately about the conflict, about the Israeli conflict, so clearly people say, okay, she's just a mouthpiece of the Israeli government. And of course, if so we can't really take it seriously. It's not really an academic article. It is not really a professional article. It's just making the Israeli case. And the same if a Palestinian would write a very, I don't know, a Hezbollah supporter would write a very passionate article against Israel, that would be the same. So I think here, from my point of view, I try to write, when I write, especially to an international audience, as objectively as I can, and I know that I will be suspect of not being objective anyway, but at least I try to distance myself from my particular conflict, to try to talk with broader examples, to bring examples from other conflicts, but then again, it's sensitive because you don't want to upset anyone, not the Americans and not the Russians and not I don't know who. So it's easier, especially if Israel is a small country and we are afraid. So to be theoretical, I don't also, aggravate anyone else, but still don't talk about my own conflict. And then maybe if I do the analysis and it's logical and it flows, then it can be taken more seriously. So I think that's another consideration of not being passionate. But I also think that some of the points that you brought about the dangers of passion, I think they are dangerous. It is dangerous when the writing is too passionate, and you say, and it's not in an issue that is already very emotional. I think it might be difficult. I think you say that those that say that it's not good to be too passionate say that it is the work of legal scholars to identify patterns and connections, analogies and abstract models, so that law can be brought to bear and can impose legal restraints on human destructiveness amid the maelstrom. And I think that's right. That's how I view the role of IHL, and I am afraid, or I put a question mark. How can you do that? How can you? This is, I think, the most important role of the laws of armed conflict, of IHL. And how can you make sure that this role continues if you put in too much passion and too much subjectiveness into the analysis? So those are my questions, and thank you very much for having me.
Stefan, do you want me to take over here? Yes, okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really great remarks. I'm going to be quite brief because I think you also are going to go to broader Q&A. So if it's okay, I'll start with Stefan's comments as to the sequel. Stay tuned. I don't have it yet. As to the question of practitioners' work, absolutely. So I think we could do a really interesting analysis of changes in the ICRC's tone over time. I found, for example, the comparison in the Pictet commentary to the contemporary one, and I don't mean to say, I don't want to make a simplistic assessment at all, just that it's interesting that today there does seem to be this sense that you need hundreds of pages, you need hundreds of footnotes, you have to take account of all of these different conceptual frameworks when fundamentally writing about the same problems, right? About the same issues, the same types of dilemmas. And I think it's a really, really interesting question, why the immediate post 9/11 environment so quickly disciplined our speech. So there's some very early writing in the weeks after 9/11 where there are some strong words from ICRC lawyers saying this is simply not a situation of armed conflict. This should be about criminal law. And almost foraying into ad bellum, which of course we know ICRC does not do as an institution, but absolutely, I think something happened there, and without making a value judgment about it, I think it's a really interesting question how practitioner speech and writing has also shifted. So I have a footnote, for example, about the US Law of War manual, that too ballooned in the number of pages and in the complexity of some of the arguments in a way that perhaps is justified by the increasing complexity of the world we live in, but I wonder about that. Your most difficult question, Stefan, is what did the Vietnam era scholars manage to achieve? And I think that's really difficult in the sense that, of course, the anti-war sentiment, at least in the US, but I think also around the world, at the time of the Vietnam War is so different from our current political milieu that I'm not sure where to draw the line between the scholars' influence and what was happening in the streets and what was happening in political contexts. So at the time, Congress, for example, was much more active in the United States on these questions. At the time, I think there was a sense that there was a political cost to secrecy. There was a political cost to a continuation of force. And without romanticizing that time and pretending that things were simpler or better than by any stretch of the imagination, and certainly not better, as I think Penina would say, in terms of the conduct of the armed forces regarding the application of IHL, I think their impact was different. So I think the expectations of the impact of scholarship were different, and that there was a sense that they understood their impact as being for the long term, as opposed to today, when I sometimes think there is this sense that you write an article, but what matters more is the blog post that immediately is tweeted, and then immediately there is a debate and a sense that the impact of your scholarship has to be sort of very rapid and in real time. And I did not get the impression that that was the self-conception of many of the scholars that were writing during the Vietnam era. That's a very partial answer to your very good question. Penina, thank you so much for your comments and for your engagement. I think that you're absolutely right to draw attention to the difference between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And my sense, I know you're going to be talking to Sam tomorrow, and of course his book is a meditation on some of these questions. But my own sense was that perhaps part of the reason that IHL and the IHL debate becomes so much more active and voluminous in the last 20 years, as opposed to debates on the use of force itself, is that precisely as you say, IHL is more of a lawyer's law. There is more technicality to engage, and there is perhaps much more of a sense amongst decision makers that that's a place where lawyers have a role and have, at least ideally, a restraining role, whereas in the context of jus ad bellum, international law is much quieter and much less capable of directly making interventions in political decision making. So I had this sense that the very technicality of IHL also lent itself to much more of the kind of complexity that we see in the contemporary pieces. And so I think you're right that the idea that lawyers have influence when they speak in the language of IHL is, of course, a victory for international law, and is an area where scholarship rightly has a claim to having influenced practice. I worry, though, that the hyper-technical abstract IHL approach also might allow us to ignore some of the jus ad bellum implications of what we are doing. So it might allow us to pretend that this wall between ad bellum and in bello that we all teach today, which, by the way, none of the Vietnam era scholars seemed very worried about, really starts to look and act like a wall. And it allows us to pretend that our work has nothing to do with the justification and the legitimization of the use of force. And that worries me. While I fully take your point that that also may add to the real world influence of IHL, and particularly its use by practitioners. And part of what I wonder is, do we need to enrich the conversation about ad bellum, and do we need to enrich our understanding of the linkages between the two fields in some ways? Secondly, I wanted to focus on your wonderful remarks about kind of being taken seriously. So I heard this a lot while I was working on the piece, and since it's been published, that there is a real sense that if you want to be taken seriously, and taken seriously both meaning that political actors or decision makers would utilize scholarship for real world decision making, and being taken seriously by colleagues and by editors, right, that are deciding whether to publish your work, that this is a real concern. And I think here, the only way we can test this is if we start to change the way we write. So for me, the idea of an Israeli, a former practitioner at a senior level, saying, I am grappling with the question of my own bias. I come to this scholarship from a place of my own situatedness, and I am aware of it, and I am engaging these abstract and general concepts, but while also thinking about the impact of my own role. I think that that could be both very scholarly and incredibly impactful. I would prefer to read that. And I think because we all know that that is true, it would be better to say so, and then kind of be able to engage it in the room. I think it is a phenomenon that many of us who have been in IHL debates in the past 20 years are familiar with, is US legal scholars who go into government for 6 months or a year and then come back to scholarship. and sometimes are writing scholarship about the exact thing that they were working on while they were in government, but do not say a word about that, neither in the publication nor in an academic presentation. That just strikes me as so strange, right? That of course we need to know more about what that means for the person articulating those views. And I say that without at all calling for a kind of self-psychologizing or opening up one's heart about one's feelings, but rather just the idea that it's serious intellectual work can involve engagement with our own biases, morality, and internal dilemmas and doubts. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Naz. I remind the participants that the Q&A is open, so do not hesitate to throw a question in writing. Before I jump to a few questions, I will give the floor to Eitan, followed by Yuval. I suggest as we compile the two questions and then you react to both of them. Eitan, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stefan. And thanks for a fascinating presentations. So I want to, in a way, complement things that Stefan and Pnina already said when relating to the perspective of practitioners who adopt this kind of impassioned way of writing. And I want to say this from the perspective, sorry about the background noises, from the perspective of a practitioner who was doing something different than what Pnina does as a practitioner. So not advising a party to the conflict, a practitioner engaging in different capacities, but nevertheless, at some points entering the academic debate and entering the academic debate with a desire to engage with various actors. And now these are actors on the ground who are very passionate about the issues. And the desire is to try to enter a debate where we can constructively look at the law without the debate being clouded by extra legal issues, the passions that we bring to the discussion. And that created this kind of motivation to adopt a language that's more technical, a language that sets some of the facts that we're all very familiar with aside and tries to look at the legal issues, to isolate them, zoom in on them, and have a constructive discussion about that. I mean, I think certainly in this context, a lot of us come with so many emotions to these discussions. It's really not productive to, I mean, tomorrow, Anne and I are going to be on a panel together. We're coming with different perspectives. I'm not sure how productive the discussion would be if we brought all our emotions about the issues to that conversation. And on this, I just want to comment that in addition to that, for me as a practitioner, the exercise of trying to set aside passions, to sort of speak in a normative language that's a bit disengaged from those emotions, has been quite useful to check. Nina alluded to this as well, to check biases, to be critical about my own positions. And then lastly on that, this is something I see quite a bit when teaching different audiences, Palestinian and Israeli, on these issues. You see how the passions cloud the discussion, how they influence it. One of the ways we try to kind of overcome that is these IHL competitions that now run all over the world, and the participants engage in debates about imaginary scenarios. And I think one of the things that's useful about those imaginary scenarios is that they disengage from a specific context. It's productive in that sense. They overcome their biases. I do always feel, though, and this is sympathetic to Naz's position, that sometimes these abstractions do create a distance from the really ugly realities of war. We speak in abstraction about these imaginary places. That does create a distance that is a bit worrisome. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Eitan. Yuval, please.
Yes, hopefully I'll be heard properly this time. So along the same lines of Eitan, I mean, if you're in the business of influencing and you want to shape policy, and you operate, well, I guess the Vietnam era was also highly polarized, but I mean, I haven't been, I mean, I haven't lived professionally through the time to basically, and it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts are about what would be the contextual differences in terms of audience reaction? Because I get a sense that, and this is something which is accelerated in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, the sense that you have two very separate communities, political communities. This is true for the States, but it's also true in many other countries, including this country. And people really cannot, once you're identified with a certain tribe, then you're not able to communicate effectively with the other ones. You're being discounted or canceled or what have you, simply because you wear the colors of one group or the other. And I'm wondering whether, in terms, if you want to have a broader impact, how conducive, I mean, how productive it would be for you, to accentuate your belonging to a certain ideological position by actually, displaying, the intensity of your feelings in support or against this or that policy, which of course has, like Lina said, a very significant baggage in terms of where you stand on the bigger issues. Now I realize that this is a bit, it's a tricky issue because you want to be transparent about, where you're coming from. But on the other hand, you also want to be heard, and you want to, and when you're dealing with legal issues, I mean, hopefully you can, you can make, you can make some, you have a professional integrity that that you can bring with you to the table, and you are not, inventing the law as you go along just in order to serve. So that will be, of course, completely unacceptable. But assuming that you do have the integrity and the capacity to communicate across the aisle, the question is whether you want to maintain this capacity. Thank you.
Back to you, Naz.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful. So, Eitan, I think first, it is not for me at all, I think, to say anything about the experience of those who are tactically and strategically thinking through the utilization of law and legal vocabulary for particular purposes where there might be tactical advantages to one or another approach to making legal arguments. I think I need to think about it more, but my initial instinct is that that is different from scholarship, and that the approach either of those who are engaging in advocacy work directly with governments, or those who are marshaling legal arguments on behalf of clients in military courts, that is a different kind of speech and writing that I would not put within this same framework. But I understand you also were saying something about the value of checking one's emotions in scholarship. So I think that's right. And I take from the Q&A, someone says, I assume that many of the Vietnam era scholars were male and probably white. They were all male and white, at least the ones that I read. So I want to be careful that this doesn't slip into saying you should share all of your personal emotions about war every time you write about war. That might be interesting, but that's not what I'm talking about. I think it's more the idea of, one, being candid about where you as a scholar are working through those biases. So not pretending as though they don't exist and then writing from a place of technicality and abstraction in order effectively to shield that internal debate and process, but rather in scholarly language, in footnoted language, in intellectual language, being candid about what it is that you are grappling with as a scholar. Second, I think it is often as simple as also being clear about your audience and your intent. So Yuval talks about influence and wanting to have influence. I think there is some international law scholarship, very wonderful international law scholarship, that does not seek to have an influence on decision makers in the immediate moment. If your project is to have an influence, however, I think that it's important to be clear about that, as in many other fields of scholarship where the introduction clearly puts forward, my project is to influence the following actors, this is why, And this is where I'm coming from in so doing. So I think it's more a request for candor than it is a request for unburdening oneself entirely as to one's political or emotional views about conflict. Finally, I do think that it is about being clearer as to one's view of the role of international law in the project that one is seeking to undertake. So it may be that you are engaging in a scholarly project in order to clarify your own thinking on some complex issues. It may be that you are engaging in a scholarly project with a very clear target of policy influence, and that's your reason for engagement. And it may be that you genuinely think that there is a fascinating intellectual question that your research is seeking to describe and uncover, that you are doing complex descriptive work so that we may all better understand the world that we live in. I think there's tremendous value to being clearer about that. I think students benefit from it. I think readers benefit from it. And I think it clarifies the purposes of our legal scholarly projects, but also clarifies where we as authors are also not yet sure, where we ourselves are uncertain as to how to shape our commitments. So again, I very much take the point, and I think there should be great care taken in how this might be carried out. But I'm not making a call for talking about our feelings. And I absolutely take your point about the panel tomorrow. And you're right that everybody coming to this conversation with all of their feelings about the conflict would not be useful. It might be fun to watch, but it would not be useful for the goals of the conversation. But I think that here it is possible to think through our own roles and our own projects in a manner that does not slip into writing diary entries.
Thank you very much, Naz. We only have 3 minutes and then I have to give back the floor. In 1 minute, Naz, can you answer one part of the many questions from Danielle, which is the scholarship used more today in politics, more than the Vietnam War era? And I think you already answered Sarah's question. Let's focus only on this one. Is the scholarship used more today in US politics?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. It's a great question. So I have not yet seen a particularly impressive attempt to empirically answer this question, and I think it would be answerable. There's some really fascinating scholarship. Leanne Bohr has written about citation practices, and there's a lot of interesting work in this area. It is not my expertise to answer the empirical question. However, I will say, I think that the scrambling for influence and the desire to have influence has had an incredible impact on scholarship being written in the US in this area. And I don't mean that as a insult. I myself work on scholarship that I would like to be influential. But I do think that the relationship between scholarship, legal advising, and political engagement is quite papered over in much of US scholarship and deserves to be openly discussed and talked about.
Thank you very much, Naz. And with those words, I suggest that we end this first session. Thank you very much to all participants. A big thanks to Naz, of course, big thanks to Pnina and Eitan and Yuval. So I hope you enjoyed this first session. There will be many other sessions, but I must leave the floor now. You will have 10 minutes break before the next session. Thank you again very much and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I might have just by mistake answered in the chat only to Emiliano. So I'm just noticing that. So unfortunately, this is still after almost 2 years, I'm still not very good at Zoom. Okay, so it is, well, in my time, it is 4:45 p.m. I don't know what it is in everybody else's time, but it's time to start, whatever time it is where you are. So very pleased to have been invited to be discussant for this wonderful panel. So this session is called Regulating War, Emotions, Values, Virtues, and there will be two papers that are going to be presented. The first one by Professor Emiliano Buis, with a paper entitled International Humanitarian Law and Emotional Normativity, Evaluating the Limits of Legal Rationalism. And secondly, a paper by Dr. Maria Varaki. I hope I'm pronouncing your name somewhat correctly. If I'm not mistaken, the title of the paper is different from what the program here suggests. So the paper that I've received is entitled, May You Live in Interesting Times or Else the Art of Critical Judgment and Responsible Scholarly Engagement. Very much looking forward to hearing your presentations. So my instructions have been that each of the speakers will have 15 minutes, about 15 minutes to present. Then I'll take a few minutes to give my comments and questions that I might have, and please, for everybody in the audience, feel free to include your questions in the Q&A, so in the Q&A chat box, so that we can make sure we get as many questions posed and answered. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Emiliano.
Thank you, Anne, very much. I want first to thank the organizers for convening this wonderful conference and for allowing me to share some ideas on an ongoing research project on rhetorical performance of international humanitarian law. And particularly here, I will discuss some aspects concerning the relationship between rhetoric and emotions. So since I have only 15 minutes, I will share my screen as soon as possible to try to summarize some of the main lines of my arguments. Even though I have very short time, I will start my presentation by going well back in time. When in 494 BC, Phrynichus decided to represent a tragedy in Athens on the recent capture of the city of Miletus by the Persians, Herodotus tells us that the theater was so shocked that it were all moved to tears. The Athenians, as a result, decided to pass a law and decided that the playwright should pay the amount of 1,000 drachmae. The grief was seen as an example of the emotional experiences of warfare, and the official fine imposed on Phrynichus was understood as an example of the centrality of law as a rational means to put limits to affective excess. Now, this opposition between emotional violence and rational legalism is, however, quite deceiving. Some Greeks were willing to accept that there was no real opposition between institutional legalism and emotional expressions, as Aristotle explains when examining the role of pathos in forensic oratory. According to him, an efficient, persuasive legal speech could not be limited to discourse, logos, but had to be complemented by ethos and by emotion, pathos. There is a high level of creativity or invention in the way emotions are channeled in the legal dimensions. Emotions, according to Aristotle, cannot be extracted from the set of cultural values embodied in social groups. Socially dependent, emotions can be aroused if the orator is able to make use of the relevant strategies. This emotional normativity can explain how lawgivers act, how judges adjudicate, and how lawyers prosecute. In spite of all this, in modern day conceptions, there seems to be no place for sentimental considerations. Specifically in IHL, the situation is not very different. Some erroneous assumptions seem to be hidden. For example, these false ideas include the fact that war is emotional, whereas law is rational. And secondly, that emotions are not a serious topic. Objectivity from this regard requires leaving emotions aside in order to endorse protection and the strict adherence to applicable rules. Now, with the purpose of overcoming these assumptions, I will attempt to bring Aristotle's theory of emotions back to the table. After a general introduction to emotional normativity, my paper discusses the theoretical exploration of this underestimated sentimental dimension of normativity. I will focus on some examples very briefly in which reference to emotional norms could play a role in improving the legitimacy and efficiency of legal provisions. And as a specific line of argument, I will present a last case study on nuclear weapons in which the management of affective metaphors and sentimental language could eventually be useful in order to show how an efficient manipulation of extra-legal normativity could play a role in IHL. So let's begin very briefly by saying that emotions are cultural and symbolic constructions. So as opposed to biologicism, cognitivist theories suggest that emotions provide value judgments. Martha Nussbaum, for example, shows that emotions are learned and reinforced through social interactions. So emotions are constituted by interactions between physical and social cultural systems. Emotions have an evaluative content. The correctness of emotions, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, and this is something subject to debate, implies that emotions are judgments, and therefore they become normative. There are norms behind emotional experiences which assess their appropriateness. There are rules in emotions, what Arlie Hochschild calls feeling rules, that demarcate the intensity, duration, direction, and objects of emotions that are appropriate in particular contexts. So if emotional normativity shows that emotions are judgments, we can then endorse the Aristotelian perspective of the rhetorical importance of pathos, because it provides us with rules about convenient feelings and on the best ways of arousing them. Now, in IHL, it seems very clear that there are deep affective origins of its codification. If we remember a memory of Solferino, Henri Dunant expressed unspeakable horrors of warfare. Strongly embedded in emotional language, however, Dunant's inspiration did not necessarily match the will of negotiating states. The legal dimension had to detach from the particular circumstances we've just discussed with the keynote speech, the idea of distance and disengagement. To regulate means basically to show the interference of external emotionality. To ensure a universal system of norms implies going beyond individual traumatic experiences. Now, objective rules in IHL, therefore, strike a balance between military necessity and humanity, and even notions such as proportionality or collateral damage are the result of logical assessments. Now, this detachment loses track of the practical life of IHL on the ground. As Rebecca Sutton has frequently shown, there is a human component on IHL in the ground. We need to show how specific feelings of humanitarian actors play a role in the field. Thinking outside of the traditional legal framework requires considering new perspectives. In its study on the roots of restraint in war in 2018, the ICRC has acknowledged the limits of the traditional legalistic approach and promoted the need for interdisciplinary tools. Stephen Ratner considers that persuasion becomes an essential means to promote legal compliance between the limits of traditional law-centered strategies. Now, this role of persuasion drives us back to Aristotle and the resort to pathos in the deployment of rhetorical strategies. And this is achieved in order to foster the respect of law. Now, my case study focuses on recent lawmaking and pictures an example of the way in which handling the appropriate affective background and weighing different emotions at stake could contribute to the emergence of new humanitarian rules. I will take, because of constraints of time, only the case study on the regulation of nuclear weapons in order to show to what extent emotional normativity in Aristotelian terms could provide an explanation for the importance of encouraging the arousal of a new set of emotions. And of course, due to time limits, I will kind of simplify my argument for the sake of time. If we start our path across the regulation of nuclear weapons, we should, of course, take into account the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1967, which still constitutes the key piece in legal terms for the regulation of nuclear activities. Now, this treaty clearly responds to a framework which results from a national security dimension. Implicitly, nuclear weapon states consolidated an efficient management of emotional normativity with a clear purpose of justifying the military possession of non-conventional weapons. Now, an understanding of this emotional normativity at stake leads us to Aristotle's Poetics. When discussing emotions in his treatise on rhetoric, he defines fear, phobos, as a painful or troubled feeling caused by the impression of an imminent evil that causes destruction or pain. We do not fear things which appear to be very remote. When the possibility of being attacked is real, then fear comes into play. Fear and terror have been used as weapons to distort the opponent's decision-making or break the opponent's will. During the Cold War, fear was at the center of the emotional normative background. The threat of nuclear annihilation, the need to ensure military capabilities that could serve as a deterrent, the creation of an enemy as a rhetorical strategy to help reinforce the defensive paradigm, the imagery related to the destruction of the planet, fear became a psychological tool fostered by suspiciousness, enmity, and hate. There was a need to ensure the survival faced to the intolerable nuclear retaliation. Now, the national defense paradigm then found a productive breeding ground in public discourse, and of course, obscured the obligation of disarmament in Article 6 of the NPT. What happened later? Now, we know that in July 2017, the adoption by several number of states who attended a meeting on the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of a new instrument was a significant path forward. The treaty that finally entered into force on the 22nd of January this year has created a new narrative based on the tragic consequences of a nuclear explosions. The treaty was based on 3 previous conferences organized in Oslo, in Nayarit, and Vienna on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. And later on, it led to the humanitarian pledge issued by the Austrian government with the purpose of filling the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. What's interesting from an emotional normative perspective is that we don't seem to be focusing anymore on the national defense or the security paradigm, but rather on the need to protect human beings from the unbearable effects of a nuclear attack. This relates to an efficient handling of appropriate emotions. In the preamble of the treaty, an explicit reference is made to the excruciating effects of nuclear weapons and to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result basically in extermination. The imagery as well has been well defined. The survivors of the US atomic bombings in Japan, the Hibakusha, vividly described the devastation they encountered. So there is a new emotive image and language related now to compassion. The Aristotelian theory of emotions can be brought back to the discussion again. When presenting pathos, Aristotle defines pity, eleos, as a feeling of pain caused by the sight of some evil, destructive or painful, which befalls one who does not deserve it, and which we might expect to befall ourselves or some friend of ours. Now, from this perspective, compassion involves a feeling of empathy, since it implies an involvement in another person's suffering. So in terms of emotional normativity, the evolution of the loss of war shows an increasingly important role of pity. The idea of undeservingness, the idea that there's no longer an opposition between we and them, but rather the consideration of human beings as fellows, them as us, as a fiction of comparison, we are led, therefore, to give relief or aid or show mercy. Now, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons creates then a new discourse about nuclear weapons that understands them as unsafe weapons of terror. In this dynamic, fear has been complemented by compassion. As Aristotle explained, emotions are a rhetorical device that helps to build an argument that can persuade others. Through the use of this affective machinery and through the intention of appealing to social values and common beliefs, emotional normativity, and this is basically the conclusion of my case study, provides a useful scenario for original lawmaking. Let's go now to the conclusion. Against all odds, and after some 20 years after Phrynichus' defeat on the Athenian stage, in 472 BC, the poet Aeschylus decided once again to stage a true recent episode of war, in this case related to the Persian invasion of Greece 9 years before. The result now was completely different. Not only was he not fined as Phrynichus, but he'd rather received an award instead. His play won the first prize at the dramatic competitions in the City Dionysia festival in Athens. Several factors could explain this dramatic change in the attitude of the Athenian people. Among them, the fact that Aeschylus seemed to have managed the emotional impact of visualizing the suffering of war. The appearance on stage of the ghost of King Darius to condemn the excess of his son, King Xerxes, to oppose his son's violent attitude and rage, implies and shows some humanitarian concerns which served as an efficient system of affective counterweights. The example to me is significant. Tragic settings do not require to exclude emotions, but rather to represent them in a way consistent with the expectations of the audience. In fact, it seems clear that tragedy needs to rely on emotions in order to fulfill its social role. Tragedy then includes a creative use of language that produces emotions, giving rise to catharsis, to a sort of purification or intellectual clarification. Something similar, in my opinion, happens with IHL. Its role is fulfilled not by excluding the emotional outburst of war, but by processing the emotional normativity related to attitudes to warfare and its consequences. As in dramatic representations, IHL should produce an appropriate catharsis through its rules and principles, relying on the importance of those perceptions and values that ought to be taken into account when enlarging our comprehension of the legal rules can benefit greatly from the extra legal normativity of emotions, which is based upon a common perception of positive and negative values. At the end of the day, the well-reasoned and intelligent management of emotions can help to promote law, to generate compliance, and to fight for more and better rules to reduce suffering in times of war. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Emiliano. So let me give the floor now to Maria.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Here it's 4 o'clock in London. I wish I were in Jerusalem with all of you, but hopefully soon. Emiliano, I love it. You know, I follow your work, you know, and it's quite interesting that two of us today we're going to talk about Aristotle from a different perspective. You talk about pathos, emotion, catharsis. I'm talking about virtues on the other hand. So, and you're very right. You know, the title is different because the title in the program also, it says Teaching International Humanitarian Law with Camille and others. And then I send you a draft paper with these bits and pieces of my work the last couple of years, talking about interesting times, but it's this very same thing, and the reference to Camille is there. So having said that, I will start with art. Emiliano started with ancient tragedy. I will take you to Venice, to the Biennale, where 2 years ago we had the International Art Exhibition of 2019. And the title of the exhibition was, May You Live in Interesting Times. So according to the president of the Biennale, the title of this exhibition could be interpreted as a source of cars, where the expression interesting times evokes the idea of challenging or even menacing times. But it could also simply be an invitation to always see and consider the cause of human events in their complexity, an invitation thus that appears to be particularly important in times when too often oversimplification seems to prevail, generated by conformism or fear. And I believe that an exhibition of art is worth our attention first and foremost if it intends to present us with art and artists as a decisive challenge to all oversimplifying attitudes. I really love art and I get inspiration from art. And I thought that was a very, very appropriate title, especially in a time where we all deal with the crisis or not, and I use quotation, or backlash against international law, against international institutions. Where do we stand? And I love the word interesting times, something that I prefer than crisis or menace or the backlash. Because although we all say, oh, that was such an interesting topic, or your paper was so interesting, we know, that interesting can be something very neutral or negative, but also it accommodates this multiplicity. And for me, this reference to interesting times, actually, I found this as a proper kind of sensibility, if you want, to question the role of scholars. I'm not talking about scholarship in the sense, of writing scholarship, like something that Nas talked about, but the way we interact, the way we daily practice international law, how we teach international humanitarian law in times of crisis. And my very modest proposition here is that for me, the interesting times, they offer a fantastic opportunity for self-challenge, for self-critique, for consideration, for moderation, but also for some kind of hope. Now, this is part of my broader, I would say, personal journey from my own topos and keros. I love using all these Greek words, they always look so sophisticated. However, I would like to situate the interesting times, with regard to IHL. So I'm teaching a course, a module, which is called International Law and War. And this is a very challenging course because it touches upon use post ad bellum and use in bellum. So the 4 years now that I'm teaching this course, I'm every year very much challenged how I'm going to teach every time in class. And this is where I come, and this is what I would like, I'm going to give you already my argument, and then I'm going to deconstruct in the next 10 minutes. So what I wrote in my draft paper, which is bits and pieces without having some case studies that I'm going to discuss now, and then I apologize in advance about that. I claim that being an international lawyer is not an easy task. Let's start with that. Now, being additionally a scholar of international law, all the day you deal with questions about its methodology, purpose, and significance, if any, especially if you teach IR students. Now, in my own case, this academic anxiety, I have said that it was further exacerbated by my role as a teacher of IHL, where the demands for commitment were always and are always surpassed by what Martin Koskinen describes the sentiments of cynicism. And I think this is something very important here. So how could someone teach about the humanitarian aspects of the laws of war and their purpose to reduce suffering without being self-annulled only moments later while bringing particular examples of power abuse and distraction? This uneasiness, I can tell you that reached its peak when while teaching, I found myself exposed to the same level of self-challenge, trying to convey a message of skepticism without being cynical at the same time towards my students. This is a very, very interesting and difficult experience that actually accelerated this increasing dilemma. What kind of action or reaction is expected by a responsible scholar in times of massive disillusionment? Is it a self-confession of failure? Let's say we failed, or is it a sensibility of critique that entails elements of what I call enlarged mentality and avoidance of excess of any kind? How can you oscillate, in other words, that I keep asking all these questions between faith and critique? And how can you address a dark reality where doctrine is challenged, and we have seen that being challenged by international legal scholars as well, and there is a growing dissatisfaction with the legalistic language of experts and scholars. So having said all that, my argument and my main proposal against this framework is I propose a less radical, as I say, method of deconstruction, away from a sterilized critique for the sake of critique. And I know that my audience here can understand what I'm talking about. Instead, I invite speakers to take inspiration by a common trend of sensibility that manifests a moderate but equally critical and responsible engagement. And I get this inspiration like Emiliano from Aristotle, of course I have to pay homage to my own country, but also from Albert Camus, Hannah Arendt, Judith Clark, Tom Frank, and also other scholars such as Albert Hirschman. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. However, I find that in the writings of these thinkers, there is a common philosophical thread of imaginary responsibility that resisted not only dogmatism, but also excess of imagination, excess of aspiration, of exertions in times of great challenges. Having said that, my own contribution based on the moderate desensibility of Camus and others will highlight the limit of excessive reaction. And I call my fellow academics when we teach and when we interact, to go beyond the academic cliché of, oh, this person is mainstream or this person is critical, and to open the path of communication. Now, Anne, for the next, do I have 7 minutes or more? Do I have? Okay. So let me say now how I'm trying. This is my main argument. My main argument is let's try, it's a call for what I call critical judgment, first of all, which implies self-critique, going beyond intransigence. And the second is let's exercise a moderate, scholarly, and responsible scholarship. So what do we mean about that? Now, I'm taking you back a little bit to the crisis discourse. I know it's very fashionable. We have books coming out, articles, everybody talks about the crisis. But of course, Hilary Charlesworth in 2002 wrote the eminent seminal article on international law as a discipline of crisis. So I'm taking inspiration from this article, and I say it's not only about the daily life of international law, where Hilary highlights, but it's also how we international legal scholars perform daily when we teach international humanitarian law, as I say, in a time of massive disillusionment. And there I take also inspiration, from Camus and Hirschman and the others, and I say, that we need to exercise our judgment. And not only we need to do our self-critique in a kind of a cathartic self-critique and to move beyond our own means in this dogmatic doctrine that, okay, we have these rules of IHL, but also when we exercise our critique on IHL to know somehow how far we can go and what kind of critique we are going to exercise. So how are we going to do that? Well, that goes back to Aristotle, Emiliano, and the rest of you. So there, I'm very much influenced, and some of you already know that I've been working with young clubbers for many years on the Virtue Ethics Project. And the idea is, that I claim that we should have particular virtues, when we teach those fields of international law, such as I say, the virtue of phronesis, which is about practical wisdom, but also we should exercise courage, humility, but also imagination. So these elements that I do propose, the first one is we need to do a critical self-reflection and see what's going on. And I can tell you that particularly during the last events in Gaza, I saw many blog posts, I saw many fellow legal scholars, trying to say, what is the purpose of IHL? Is there any relativity? How can we explain IHL to a layman? Okay, due to all its indeterminacy, does it make sense? And there I can tell you that I felt very uncomfortable and uneasy because I always try to say, okay, this is law, but you understand, law is not like this, legal norms, and at the end of the day, I always go back to Koskiniani's culture of formalism, trying to say, yes, this is law, but there is something, okay, law is determinate, but there is something there different of law from politics or of law of other things. There is this culture of formalism, which I have not identified until now. However, my biggest challenge, is how do I try to convey this message of grayness, you know, without discouraging students or without making students overly cynical, because, you know, the rules of IHL are full of indeterminacy and you have all these pictures, you know, and emotions. And yes, you have a generic rule, but you know, this bad, and then students leave the class and they say, but nothing applies, and you have excellent legal advisors, you know, who can manipulate the language. So having said that, you know, I go back into the virtue ethics, and already, you know, the word ethics, it's not about professional ethics, it's not how you are a legal advisor, but it's how you're a legal scholar, how you teach, how you convey messages, and if it goes back to the question of Yuval and Eitan and others, how you influence if you're going to influence, you know, keeping this moderation, saying, yes, reality is very nuanced. However, you know, there are some rules, and these rules can be interpreted in a very obscure way. However, there is something there. And the two examples, and I apologize for that, I'm going to incorporate them, that I didn't mention, is always I find very challenging when I give them two things. First of all, is the documentary The Law in These Parts, the Israeli documentary. When I show this documentary, you know, to my IHL students, and I'm always concerned, you know, I expose them to the law of occupation, okay? But there are many, many strong sentiments coming out of this documentary. So the discussion, the discourse after this documentary become even more challenging for me, you know, how you guide, you analyze, you say, you know, because the reaction is, oh my God, this is totally arbitrary, you know, there is no law. And then also not only anti-Semitic arguments, which are very, very problematic. Okay, this is the first thing. And the second thing that I find always challenging is when I go back again to the Biennale and I give them the example of the letter to a refusing pilot, which is a real story of an Israeli pilot who refused to throw a bomb in 1982 because he had studied architecture and he knew that it was a school, okay, in Beirut, in Lebanon. So I'm trying, you know, to show both this documentary and a piece of art, and at the same time, I try to keep the path of communication. But also, I can tell you that I always find myself in so much anxiety. To what extent, you know, I can exercise my phronesis, how courageous I am, how far I can go with my critique. So in the paper, I propose a couple of things, you know, which I don't like to be a policy paper, but these are some of my ideas. And one of them is that I think it's very important to keep the path of communication open. Okay, and it's very true that especially with IHL, the indeterminacy of international law hits its peak. Let's start with the basic, you know. The second thing is to try to explain elusive concepts as much as possible by being extremely frank and sincere. You know, that at the end of the day, you know, it's all about interpretation, and being a good legal advisor means that you can do whatever you want at the end of the day. Sorry, but this is true. The third one is to have this self-critique, you know, but for me, the most challenging thing is to convey messages of skepticism, reasoned skepticism, but not of excess and cynicism. Having said that, you know, I will stop here because I would love to listen to all your comments, but Anne, I own that to you, you know, so I'm going back to Camille. And I want to read, sorry for that, I want to read something, and that's how I'm going to conclude. So Camille, in one of his most interesting writings, you know, which already the title is fascinating, it was called Create Dangerously. So it's also the danger of that over there. He says that an Oriental wise man always used to ask the divinity in his prayers to be so kind as to spare him from living in an interesting era. As we are not wise, the divinity has not spared us, and we are living in an interesting era. In any case, our era forces us to take an interest in it. So my call is a call to take an interest in this complexity and lack of oversimplification, and try, you know, understand what it means to be a responsible scholar. So when you walk into a class, when you go into an academic conference, when you apply for a funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Yeah, it's too bad we can't do proper clapping. Well, I can do clapping, but I think I'm the only one who has my microphone on at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to just take I'll take a few minutes to ask some questions to both Emiliano and Maria. And then I already see there was one question in the Q&A, and I'd really invite everybody who has any question to ask to put it in the Q&A so that Emiliano and Maria can respond to those questions as well. I won't take too much time. So thank you so much, Emiliano. It's really a pleasure to sort of see you, albeit on screen this time, and to hear more about your research. So even though my area isn't IHL, I'm very much into emotions and sentiments and all that, of course. So I have a couple of questions for you, and I just want to add a disclaimer that a lot of these questions, I'm asking you questions that I also get asked, and I don't necessarily, or I absolutely do not know the response to those questions, but I know that these are questions that are often asked. And I guess my first response was, sort of the first few times I'd get these questions, I thought, oh, but that's not what I meant, or how am I supposed to explain that? But I think over time I've become a little bit more sort of thinking, okay, I do need to find a response. So I'm also just using you to see how you're responding to these questions. So one, it's sort of a big overarching question that I have. You talk about using emotions to improve the legitimacy and efficiency of legal provisions, right? And in this case specifically, IHL provisions, and looking at your case study of regulation of nuclear weapons. So I'm sort of, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the mechanisms. So how does that work? How do you regulate? How do you improve the legitimacy and efficiency of legal provisions, and what mechanisms would, for instance, so you're talking about encouraging the arousal of different emotions, right? Of going from fear to pity, for example. And how does that work? How does that, through what mechanism does that work? Which actors would be involved in that? Maybe just sort of short examples. And I was also wondering, which I think is related, it's related in a sense to the first question, whether you're looking at, there's so much literature on emotions that's, it's overwhelming. I mean, you try to get into it and you think, wow, like under which rock have I been living that I haven't noticed that all of that is out there. And I wonder whether you're looking at, I mean, of course you are looking at, you're always looking at other disciplines, that's, in your work, but if you're looking at any particular methods, I guess, that are used, for instance, in psychology, in terms of how you regulate emotions. So I was reading, it was actually it's not a very new article, one of Terry Maroney's pieces on, she uses sort of what's called emotion regulation theory in psychology. Well, this is particularly a piece on looking at emotions of judges. So, I mean, it was a different context, but I sort of wonder whether that's something that you're looking at, or might be, maybe you haven't looked at it yet, but I think it might be interesting just because it might address a little bit those questions about, okay, how do we do that? Because I think, at least in my experience, I haven't really, maybe it depends on the audience that I've been encountering, but I haven't really met anybody in a sort of audience of international law who would reject the influence of emotions. But it's just sort of going one step further. Okay, well, maybe there are, yeah. Maybe they haven't dared. I have a few. I have a few people who would, but I think the bigger question would be, I mean, the bigger question that I get, okay, what do we do with that? So how do you actually go about doing that? So I guess that's where this first question is coming from. And then secondly, I just had a thought, which is more a comment than a question, really. I was thinking about when you were talking about from fear to pity, I was thinking about, well, I'd been reading a little bit about sort of very broadly the history of humanitarianism, so not really, and of the role that pity plays, and some of the examples. I was reading a report by Doctors Without Borders, and sort of going through the history, the history of how humanitarian advocacy works, and so one of the arguments that was made is that pity used to play a big role, at least in advocacy. I'm not talking about, so obviously your example is a different one. So you're looking particularly at nuclear weapons, but I found it really interesting, this pity discourse. So one of the examples that was given is, used to be you get, for example, to get humanitarian action or to get support for humanitarian action, you'd get very personalized, look at this child suffering, and sort of imagery that's supposed to evoke pity. Whereas it's much more, a lot of this advocacy is much more rational, I guess, if you want to separate those two in a way. So it's much more about numbers and figures and statistics, and right, this many people and this percentage. So I was just wondering whether that might be something that would be relevant to look at in the context of your case study as well. But yeah, really enjoyed your paper, and I also just you did write that in there, that it's a work in progress, which is, I think, wonderful to be discussing. So thank you so much. I will maybe just turn to Maria and the same, have some comments and questions. I think we're the first session, right? So I'm kind of winging it. I'm not winging it, but I'm sort of deciding how we run this. so I'll give my comments to Maria as well. Then perhaps when I finish, I'll give you time to respond briefly, and in the meantime, give everybody else a chance to put their questions in the chat. So Maria, wow, I can't tell you how much your piece resonated with me, even though it's quite far from what I do in a sense. But I was like, yes, I totally, I don't do humanitarian law, but those exact same sort of feelings. I mean, every week when I'm in front of my class, talking about climate change or food and agriculture and international law, you just think, how do I sort of juggle between this? You have to be realistic, and this law is not going to, international law is not going to save us. And I get very questions like, and I have to tell you, I teach only master's and PhD students, so I can imagine that when you're teaching also undergraduate students, it makes it even more difficult, because you're at least the students that I have in my classes have already had some exposure to to the challenges of not just academia, but the world, I guess, and international law in general. So really resonated with me so much. And I really like this reference to interesting times. And I just wanted to link that, I think, to Emiliano's work, because first I thought, oh, this is really, quite different pieces of work. Of course, there's always overlap that you can find, because I found it interesting. You were saying, interesting. Yes, I found it interesting. I caught myself using that. Preferable, to using menacing or crisis or any other. And I thought there's a lot of emotion in that you tag onto those words, crisis and menacing. And I thought that's really interesting, because I think quite often, at least in my experience, when you do any research on emotions, or you try to sort of bring emotions or sentiments in, can be quite an assumption that you have certain ideas about what that means. And I think what you're really trying to do, which I love, is keeping it open. Like, of course we have to consider these sentiments, but not in one particular way. It's not like we have to think about the interesting times, which are interesting times indeed. And I know this is what I notice, actually, especially with students, is that they get a little confused sometimes when you don't move straight into the crisis mode. When you're like, actually, let's not talk about how the world is going to end if whatever well, depending on which subject area you're looking at. But I really feel there's quite it's almost as if they're like, oh, is there another way to look at it? So I just wanted to say I really find that fantastic and so much beyond IHL, obviously. I have a question about which, so I know you're addressing particularly academics and I guess especially in this case teachers. So how do you teach this? And I was wondering, and I guess this plays a role in all fields of international law, but I'm sure in humanitarian law particularly, and I guess also for many of you in the audience. How does this work in, or what's the influence, or is there an influence of, you know, double roles? So a lot of people are academics, but they're also practitioners. They're working in the field. You know, they might be legal advisors. And I was in a session once with Marti Koskaniemi actually, where somebody asked that question, you know, how do you do that as a legal advisor on the one hand, but then also as an academic, and how do you kind of balance those things? So I had a class a few days ago where I really had to tell my students, I'm like, the opinion that I'm sharing now is my opinion as an academic. And if I were now in a position as a practitioner, I would say something different, not because I'm a different person, but just because I think there are different things that are important. So I wonder how you engage with that as well, because I guess the reality is that you know, most students, unless you have a class of PhD students, most students are going to go into practice of some sort rather than academia. So I wondered how you engage with that. Yeah, that was actually that was really my main question, and I guess just a smaller question, which I'm really just very curious about, is how. So you said you've been teaching the course for 4 years, and I wonder how that how your students have responded, or if you've received response or explicit, I don't know if any explicit response from students, because I guess you're quite open about this is a challenge and you're not always sure where you stand, or, you know, which, you know, you might have days where you're more cynical and you might have days when you're less cynical, and that's part of life as well. All right, thank you so much. So I already see there's one question which was posed actually a while ago already to Emiliano in the Q&A from Daniel, and then there's a question, Yuval has a question, so I'm not sure if, do you respond to the questions that are typed in the Q&A, or do we give people the floor to pose their questions? Okay, let me just give Emiliano the floor. I'd say you can respond maybe to my questions if you'd like, and then respond to Daniel's question.
Perfect. So thanks a lot, Anne, for your question, and thanks also to Daniel for the question on the Q&A. Very interesting questions, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to deal with them, because in fact, when one works on emotions and the rhetoric and performance of international law, these questions usually come and go, and frequently challenge some of the ways you perceive some of the extra legal factors. So concerning your specific question on mechanisms and how to distinguish and how to analyze the ways in which emotions could be eventually aroused or evoked, this is sometimes very, very subtle. So we were discussing in the previous panel the problems of overshowing emotions. So in general, when we talk about the efficient ways of arousing emotions, what we tend to identify is subtle ways which are not quite overly affective or emotional. As far as my way of looking at emotions is concerned, and maybe this is because of my previous training, I tend to come from a discourse analysis perspective. So I feel usually more comfortable, usually working first on the language in which emotions are expressed. This is very interesting because there has been a lot of work on emotional language and the use of affective language in order to try to replace a word with another word, euphemisms, try to avoid some words which could eventually lead to the wrong affective response, etc. This is why one of the areas in which I'm exploring this aspect has to do with the interaction and negotiations in lawmaking, in which, of course, there's this discussion on the wording of instruments that could eventually awaken a specific feeling or emotional reaction. A second way in which one could eventually deal with how international humanitarian law deals with the way of evoking emotions, and this has come to be a recent area of study, has to do with the power of images. You mentioned, Anne, the importance of imagery to some degrees, and there has been some work done on the effects of visualizing war. Not only in my case study, I just briefly mentioned the idea of the hibakusha and these images and photographs of these people who had suffered in their own skin the effects of the nuclear explosion. But basically, images of war have been studied very recently by Blaker and a group of people who are trying to analyze the way in which, to some degree, many humanitarian stakeholders get use of those images in order to produce a specific result. And this maybe leads me to the second part of the question, which has to do with the way in which emotions are regulated. And maybe I will start joining my answer to Daniel's question online. When we talk about emotions, at least this is the perspective I usually rely on when talking about emotions. I'm not referring to specific emotions of very specific people who are experiencing different factors in the field. This is very interesting, but of course, I think I don't have enough skills or training in order to deal with this kind of sociological analysis on the field to see the concrete effects on very specific people about how war impacts, or eventually how international humanitarian law is basically perceived. There's also another problem with this, which is that in many times, we as specific people, we tend to find it difficult to express what we really feel. It's hard sometimes in our everyday life to talk about the emotions we are experiencing. So this, of course, makes it very difficult to build a theoretical construction on the basis of particular experience. This is why I tend to identify more with the idea that when you deal with the emotional normativity, you're dealing basically with social emotions. This idea that emotions are usually created out of public interactions, the idea of collective emotions, which is some of the aspects that cognitive theorists have been developing. The idea that whenever you feel something, this is because you are in the context of an in-group experience in which there are some common values that justify the way in which you judge things that happens to you. This is why emotions and reason can never be separated quite neatly, because in fact, when you are in a context of an emotional community, then of course the reason why some emotions have certain impact and can be evaluated positively or negatively is because, of course, there's this degree of judgment and values which are, of course, at the bottom. If this is the way I understand emotions, then what interests me is the way in which these emotions are managed. This is why, at least in the paper I presented today, I try to focus exclusively on this rhetorical way of dealing with this emotional normativity, because this happens. And so Daniel asked a question about whether relying on emotions as a factor of change would not lead to instability and inconsistency of IHL. Well, this is, of course, one of the fears that most IHL scholars tend to include to exclude the relevance of the emotional factor. But I think Maria explained it quite neatly. IHL is not stable in itself. So there's a lot of instability in IHL itself. So the fact of thinking that IHL is universal and it provides with its principle the solution to every single situation of armed conflict is, of course, not only erroneous, but basically it's a rhetorical construction. So there's this idea that basically IHL is built over a rational fiction or a fiction of rationality. So of course we have to tackle the debate in the sense that we should not rely on the overarching existence of universal norms itself, neither on the eventual change of individual feelings on the field. So in that sense, that's where my analysis of emotions falls. In the middle of, on the one side, this apparently technical knowledge of legal IHL that could be eventually applied universally, and on the other side, the real life of stakeholders which share some values in a specific human group. And finally, I know I have been taking too much. I love your comment about the history of humanitarianism. This is one of the topics which I think it's very interesting in order to see how, to a certain degree, emotions could be rationalized. Because of course, when you deal with advocacy, there's this idea that when you deal with the emotional experiences, you need to label them. So either you consider victims as opposed to those people who participate in hostilities. So when you label, you rationalize the way in which you consider emotions. And in that sense, emotions kind of become fossilized and they start to make a part of this fiction of rationalization. So I think that's a nice point. I will leave it there. I have some 2 or 3 more comments, which I will discuss if time allows. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Maria, if I could give you the floor for a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, it's quite short. I do see that there are, so afterwards, I'd like to give the floor. There are 3 questions from our fellow panelists.
Yeah.
We'll take those after. Go ahead.
Yeah, I saw the comments I went through in the chat,
Okay.
you know, by Yuval and Joshua, if I'm correct, you know, so I can respond. So yes, it's quite interesting because emotions are virtues. If we go back to the interesting time, and yeah, I mean, if we go back to Aristotle, you know, some particular virtues have elements of emotion, such as phronesis, for example. So there is a link over there. And also, you know, I wanted to mention, Anne, when you said, you know, who says against emotions, but I mean, personally, several times I was criticized for using emotions or for using virtue. Ethics, especially the words ethics, you know, can freak out everyone. Oh my God, how you bring back? And because everybody thinks it's Kantian ethics, you know, oh, this is bad. But from particular schools of thought, we know that, you know, and if we go back to Naz discussion about the lack of passionate reasoning, you know, you can see that from all schools of thought, but I'm not going to go there. Now, having said that, for me, my invitation, you know, about this self-challenge is very much related to what students expect from law, to put it simply like that. It goes back to zero, to the fundamentals. You know, students come and they think that we will give them an answer. Okay, and law is the answer. So the other day I had a student who said, I'm very disappointed by international law. And I say, why are you so disappointed 9 a.m. in the morning? And she told me, because blah, 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 you know, and I say, yeah, so what do you expect from international law? So we shouldn't underestimate how important it is to go back to the basics, you know, and say, well, law is beyond a set of legal norms doing interstate disputes, and law is not about objectivity. So we touch upon the real fundamental theoretical question of the nature of international law first, and its indeterminacy. Koskiniemi is always, but we go beyond Koskiniemi. My invitation is that you need to do this self-challenge without the predetermined solutions and answers, and leave it open-ended, which is not satisfactory to students, to put it simply like that, because students and lawyers, we want clear answers, right? The objectivity, the concreteness, you know, what differentiates international law from international politics. We have an answer, but more and more, international law does not give a direct answer. What international law is, it directs us into different modalities of thinking to find possible answers. Okay, and that's more than, it's very unsatisfactory. So the question is, how do you deal with this non-satisfaction by students who want one answer? Okay, this is what they want. Now, having said that, you know, this is, for me, it's very important, you know, to go back into the sense of reality, but I don't have time. My last observation to Joshua and Yuval. Joshua, for me, professional ethics, I'm sorry, I will be very blunt, is not enough. We have seen professional ethics in all international organizations, and we have crap international legal servants, okay? And we have seen how international professional ethics, oh, you need objectivity, blah, 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 integrity. And then some of the worst judgments come out of this profession. The professional ethics are ticked, but the substance is far from what we want. So professional ethics is not enough, you know, it's not enough to say, I cannot use this, I'm not going to talk about this case. That's why I go into the virtue ethics, which is beyond, it's how you exercise your judgment in every single situation. Okay, whether you are a legal advisor or whether you're a legal scholar, how far you can go, what you can say, what kind of critique based on your audience. You have to know who you address. It's not the same audience, the student who is 19 and 20-year-old with the PhD student who is 30-year-old. It's not the same to address. So for me, professional ethics, I'm sorry, I don't believe in this code of professional ethics only. I think it's important, but it's not enough. It just tick. And we have seen, I can name and mention, you know, particular instances of international civil service, which is very embarrassing. And the question to Yuval, yes, I think there is a difference between human rights law and IHL, at least when it comes to me. We know the critique on human rights law, and the critique of human rights law has been 30 years now, whether it started from the realist, legal realist, critical legal studies, tomorrow is Samuel Moyn. You know, we are going to talk about how the limits of, if any, of international human rights law. Still, I think international humanitarian law, due to these elusive concepts we have, you know, it can be more challenging for teachers to give, as I say, the answers students expect from. And with human rights law, we have more cases of success, if you know what, more concrete cases. I mean, we have many, many failures, if you want me to put there, but you can come up with more concrete cases. And I think the critique to some extent fades away or take different. With IHL, more and more you see a critique again going back to the fundamentals, to history, to the logic, and also it's a different logic. Human rights law is a good law, to put it simply like that. IHL accepts cruelty. IHL is supposed to reduce, but it accepts already the bad thing, the initial bad thing. And this becomes even more difficult, but maybe I'm wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I am afraid I'm probably going to have to be a good moderator also for the sessions that come after and for everybody to take a break. We have got just a few minutes over time. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to end the session, even though I could be here for hours talking to you. So thank you so much, Emiliano and Maria, and thank you to the organizers for putting this wonderful program together and for inviting me on it. If I'm not mistaken, you will now have a break of about 12 minutes before the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much all. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, Maria. A pleasure.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to ask the administrator to turn on my video. Welcome back for our final session this evening. Can everybody hear me and see me? Okay, Mateos is saying yes, so I will assume that works for all of you. Good evening to everybody. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces, albeit on a screen, but nevertheless. My name is Maya Karen. I'm the legal advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Israel and the Occupied Territories. We know well, and we've already touched on the fact that there's a significant gap between the formal rules of international humanitarian law, of IHL, and popular perceptions of what constitutes legitimate conduct in and around the theater of hostilities. And this tension is felt, I think, most acutely during the use of force in the framework of armed conflict, whether that be international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict. So practices such as civilian incidental injury, targeted killings, which are accepted in some circumstances and viewed as lawful by many IHL scholars and practitioners, in the field are often viewed with horror or disgust by the general public. And at the same time, we see other members of the public who criticize the restraining effects of IHL from the opposite direction because they allegedly hamper the ability of governments to take effective security measures against military, security, and terrorist threats. In this final session today, which is entitled The Slippery Slope of Force Use, we'll delve into some of these issues. We'll be hearing not from two, but from one speaker today. Mateos, before I introduce you, I welcome you to take a bit more than 15 minutes in your presentation, should you want to. So now for a presentation of our speaker this evening. Dr. Mateusz Piałkowski is an assistant professor at the University of Lodz, Poland, Faculty of Law and Administration, whose areas of focus is the law of air warfare. His doctoral thesis, entitled Modern Aerial Warfare and International Humanitarian Law, received distinction by the Polish Red Cross for the best PhD thesis on international humanitarian law. So in a moment, I'll invite Mateos to present us with his presentation, after which I'll share with him a few of my thoughts, questions, and then I'll open the floor to any questions that you might have from the audience. So without further ado, Mateos, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening already. I think here in Poland it's middle of the night because the sun is going down so fast. It's almost winter and it's a little bit terrible moment in the year. But nevertheless, first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizing for accepting my paper. It's a great honor to be here, to have the opportunity to present the ideas with so many prominent experts on the international humanitarian law. And now I am turning on the presentation. I hope it will work. Sure. I hope you're seeing my presentation.
We are.
Okay, great. Okay. Once again. All right. So maybe this way would be more sufficient. Okay. Are you still seeing my presentation or not? No. Okay. Now it's correct. All right. Thank you. So without any further delay, I would like to present my paper, my presentation regarding the air bombardments during the World War II the problem of non-healing wound and the clash between the use in bello and historical perspectives. And I would like to also maybe some
Matthias, I'm sorry to intervene. We can see here we go. Now we can see our PowerPoint. Beforehand we saw the draft.
Now you're seeing, okay, because it's kind of not in this because I do have two screens. And all right, maybe I'll try again. Okay, so maybe let's remain in this mode. I hope it's going to be okay. So to begin with the topic, the outline of the topic, what is the problem? Why I wonder that the scholar somehow should, contemporary scholar somehow should discuss the conduct of air bombardment during the World War II. And in my opinion, the discussion regarding the bombardment is still being shaped by the emotions, is still being shaped by the overall common beliefs, and I think this phenomenon is still very active today. I would say this is some kind of cross generation problem, because actually this discussion is not being fueled, is not being somehow driven, directed by the living witness of the bombardments of the World War II, but it's a rather cross generation problem that actually, in my opinion, in foreseeable future is going to be still active. So just like when the Queen Elizabeth II visited the Dresden, she actually visited the Dresden twice, once in 1995, and I guess already in 21st century, the Queen was greeted with the crowd of the protesters, chanting anti-British slogans, words, memorizing, of course, the tragedy of Dresden that happened on the 13th February 1945. And of course, this is all circulating about the legacy of the person here inside, Arthur Bomber Harris, who actually was the mastermind of the British bomber offensive during the World War II. And of course, in the same year, just like the Queen Elizabeth II was visiting the Dresden, actually the Queen Mother unveiled the statue, the monument. And what is interesting, in 2020, in the British press, there was a discussion what to do with the Harris legacy. Is he a war hero or a war criminal? There was some kind of concern that maybe the person such Bomber Harris should not be at the monument, should not be somehow cherished or memorized. We rather should exclude his character out of the history. This is not only based on the experience of the World War II, not only directly attached to the World War II, because we have to remember that Harris, before the war, was one of the commanding units in RAF in colonial areas, especially in the Middle East. And Harris adopted a policy that is being called an air policing, a military, let's say, aviation tactic called air policing. He actually used the air power to suppress the insurgent movements in the Middle East in order to maintain the colony in order. And he was deeply influenced by the air policing tactics, because that's where his idea of moral bombardment, well, it wasn't entirely the idea of Arthur Bomber Harris, because later it was endorsed by the Lindemann plan, but generally Harris was a great let's say, supporter of the idea of the morale bombardment, that basically not only we are attacking the district, the factories, we are also attacking the morale of German working class in order to somehow break it down, to create some kind of resistance in the Third Reich and to speed the Allied victory. So this is not only related, this discussion is not only related to his activities during the World War II, but also very interesting period before the war, before the World War II, actually in the interwar period. And even now in 2021, because actually I'm referring to the Euro 2020, there was also some kind of discussion concerning the song. It's a customary English football fan song called 10 German Bombers. As actually this song was created during the Blitz, German Blitz over the Britain. It's sung from the war and is considered to be inappropriate, especially because the English fans were using these songs during the official matches, official fixtures against Germany. And actually, there was also a discussion concerning quite recently, because we are talking about the 2021. So this is the emotional side. But we can go even further. We could go into the remembrance and future. And actually, the air bombardment are important part of national memory or even identity. And especially here as a Pole and as a person living close by, because University of Łódź is regional high school for, well, it's a regional university for the Łódzkie region, and Wieluń is actually located around 60 kilometers from the hometown of my university, and every anniversary of the outbreak of the War II actually took place in the town of Wieluń. And Wieluń was being considered by many historians as a first military action of the World War II. It's actually what was disputed, that actually it all started at 4:40 a.m. 5 minutes prior to the shelling of the Westerplatte by the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, because it was 4:45, 1st September 1949, and actually there was some kind of the research after the 90s revealed that actually the Wieluń was first. That the first bomb fell on Wieluń on 4:40, 5 minutes before the Schleswig-Holstein battleship starts to attack the Polish position on Westerplatte. Nonetheless, recent developments are actually not confirming this hour, because this hour probably is now set to be 5:40, because there was some kind of disagreement between the time zone, whether there was a summer or winter time in Germany or Poland, and actually that created some kind of confusion by analyzing the reports of German aviation. Nevertheless, still, this was the action directed against the civilian population, because Wieluń was not occupied by the Polish forces, was not defended by, was not fortified in any way, and it's very, very still ambiguous why the Germans used so much aircraft to attack the little frontier town with a relatively very marginal military value. And actually, the Germans authors are providing some kind of insight in this area, stating that the Wieluń was targeted because the Germans would like to try the efficiency of those planes you are seeing here, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. They would like to determine, to measure whether this bomber is efficient as an urban zone destroyer. And actually, I think it failed the test, because over 90 Stukas were bombarded, because Wieluń was bombarded for 3 times. 90 dive bombers were involved, and it's also contrary to the Blitzkrieg idea, because in the scheme of Blitzkrieg area, Blitzkrieg tactics, Blitzkrieg's doctrine, Stuka was some kind of sort aerial artillery that was going to precisely attack and destroy the enemy. It was not designed to attack the urban areas. So, but still, very, very fundamentally interesting legal question circulating, whether it was actually a violation of the law of war. What, for instance, the time of the attack? Does it change anything in this classification? And this is still a part of a wide discussion, still active in Poland. Not only in Poland, other countries, for instance, in China, President Xi actually turned to the history that the China is now building the national historical viewpoint around the so-called war of resistance against Japanese aggression. And we have to remember that the activities of the Japanese invasion of China, those real activities, are one of the least researched and definitely one of the most controversial. Even what is quite interestingly, what the Japan during this conflict claimed that it will perform its aerial operation in accordance with unratified Hague Rules of Air Warfare of 1923, which is quite also very interesting for the legal background. Here we do have the president of the International Olympic Committee, and there was a dispute in 2021 because the town hall of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made a request, made some kind of petition to the International Olympic Committee to memorize the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombardment during the opening ceremony of the Tokyo Olympic Games. And actually the International Olympic Committee refused. And of course, it creates some kind of dissatisfaction on the side of residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. However, this narration, in my opinion, in my viewpoint, is not being driven. It's not, let's say, this discussion. There is no. I would not say there are no room for lawyers, but actually, this discussion is being driven by non-legal factors, actually stemming from other reasons, from resource coming from history, social reasons, and policy. And well, basically, it's showing that there is some kind of, in my opinion, there is some kind of serious lack of among the contemporary international legal scholars, that they are no longer discussing those topics. They actually did in the past discuss it, and actually before 1997, because I do consider that in the discussion concerning the law of air bombardment and bombings during the World War II, the year 1977 is some kind of a cut-off date. Actually, there was what is also significantly, there was a division between the international experts, because of course they did address the issue because there were a lot of questions. And for instance, the American and the British lawyers like Lauterpacht, Jessup, Taylor, they actually pointed out that, well, the background of international law was so ambiguous. We cannot determine that all operations, that all controversial attacks against residents are actually the violation of the law of war, and basically the one huge question mark on the law of warfare. While actually there was some kind of opposition, which actually this opposition was formed. Like not formal opposition, but actually there were some kind of opposite viewpoints presented by the lawyers from Sweden, like Professor Hans Blix, lawyers from Germany with two very interesting viewpoints, Eberhard Spätzler and Heinz Markus Hanke, and also the Polish lawyers, actually the Professor Remigiusz Bieżanek and Dr. Zbigniew Rotocki. Professor Bieżanek was actually a chief of my own international law department, because he started his academic career at the University of Łódź, one of the well-known Polish experts on the law of warfare, and they do have different views than the British and American doctrine. Especially the main area of friction, if we take a brief note through these ideas, was the customary character of the Hague Rules of Air Warfare 1923. Whether it acquired the status of customary law before the war, whether it was to some point a valid international law architecture, at least until the Operation Millennium, because I do believe, and I think it's also the idea of Professor Lauterpacht, that until 1942, until the Operation Millennium, the 1,000 bombers right against the German column, was actually the turning point, that actually the law of air warfare collapsed after the 1942, maybe even into some kind of non-liquid situation. And of course, maybe I don't want to create any objections towards the lawyers, because for me, it's completely natural and it's being expected from the lawyers that we should catch up with the reality, that we should be, let's say, actual, always updated. We should always know the recent legislation, especially if you are a legal practitioner. You are expected that you are going to keep up with the legislation, especially the COVID times, like the new bills, the new acts were produced every day. And also in terms of, I guess, of international humanitarian law, that we are focusing on the recent events, on the conflicts, on the challenges that are ahead, like autonomous weapons systems and etc. So in my opinion, this is something natural, but still, nevertheless, the history, the World War II is still somehow behind a little bit the main pace, that the safeguard is much further, while the tail is the history, and it's still there. But I would like to also emphasize that this viewpoint somehow also resonates on other conflicts. I'm talking about the post-Second World War conflicts, like the Korean War, which has been called forgotten. And in my opinion, it's also forgotten in terms of the international of the law of war, and also Vietnam War, especially from the viewpoint of the conduct for hostilities, which is an area, in my opinion, somehow an uncharted, unexplored area. How to, for instance, review from the perspective of the law of war, the operations of American aviation during the Vietnam War. And I always try to explain to students that the international humanitarian law is built like a Jenga tower, that actually you have to balance everything, and you have to remember that there is a base, and you build the legal regime around this base. And basically, it's also imperative from the lawyers to somehow understand this major developments of to explain why the international humanitarian law is developing, and what is the attitude of contemporary international humanitarian law towards the, let's say, I would not say the Hague Regulation are historical. Maybe they are just historical because of the date, but we have to remember that the Hague Regulation, which was in fact a binding picture of international law during the World War II, have never been replaced, have never been undermined. They are part of customary law since the World War I. And sometimes the historian may ask, okay, you're now talking about that indiscriminate bombardment is being prohibited because you're citing Article 48, Article 51, 52, 57 of the Additional Protocol 1. But okay, there is Article 25, the Hague Regulation, and I heard Hague Regulation is still binding at all. So what is the relation between the old rules concerning the bombardment and more contemporary approach? And this is something, in my opinion, which is also imperative, because the lawyers themselves, especially this is an excerpt from the Geneva Convention diplomatic conference papers, the preparatory works. And actually, when there was a discussion concerning part 4 of the Additional Protocol 1, the experts of the delegates of the states actually pointed out, okay, let's now go into detail into the law of the air warfare, because it's too time consuming and it's too difficult. So basically, somehow we just leave it behind, the problem regarding the air bombardments. But of course, they were still active. They were considered to be a flying wheel for future development. The problem was detected, but actually it was not discussed, in fact. And maybe a brief few points about the law itself, that there also changes in military perspective, that this medieval style Siege warfare until 19th century mean surrender or being subject to pillage. And actually the pillage, the ransacking, the looting of the towns in the middle of the 19th century was considered to be contrary to the military demands, because it hampers the discipline of the armed forces. And then we got this, we have a significant change due to military technology, due to, well, infrastructure changes, to the urban warfare. And actually there was a decision, surrender or be subject to bombardment. And basically, when the first Hague Peace Conference was debated, was organized, we have to remember that the international humanitarian law, in order to progress, there need to be alignment between the humanitarian perspective and military vision. And the military said during the 1899 said, okay, prohibition on prohibition of bombarding defended towns is completely acceptable, because if the town is defenseless, there is no point of wasting ammunition. So there was a widespread acceptance of the rule itself. But actually, if the town dared to defend itself, then actually it was accepted that the belligerent have a right to bombard the location as a whole. City was no longer protected by the defensive law, so actually the attacker was not obliged to confine his artillery fire to the certain areas of resistance, but actually it was the acceptance of the indiscriminate bombardment, because it was also accepted that the bombardment could impact the morale of civilian population and could speed up the victory. And actually, in the middle of between the first Hague Peace Conference and the second Hague Peace Conference, of course, I have to say that there was an attempt during the first Hague Conference to outlaw the air bombardment, but actually it wasn't very successful. It was just only a temporal moratorium. And in 1907, we do have artillery, and there is the arrival of aviation. And there is a problem because how to address the new method of warfare, which was still a little bit in the development phase, and there was a widespread also agreement. Okay, this could be an effective weapon, but this could be an effective weapon. So let's not prohibit it completely. Let's create some kind of constant limitation, I would say, and that's why the Article 25 was modified to also be applicable in times of air bombardment. And it created a little bit of disaster, because the aircraft cannot occupy the land. It is impossible to open or surrender the town or city to the aircraft. Classical operations are reconnaissance, bombardment, suppression of the enemy aviation. Actually, there could be some kind of discussion to what extent the airborne operation, like Merkur, the German landing on Crete, or the Market Garden operation in Netherlands, could be somehow attributed to the concept of that the aircraft is occupying the land. But I would say not. This is just a tool of transportation, not the method of seizing control over the portion of the land. And there is a second problem, how to measure whether the town, city, or building is defended in the context of the air operation. And when I was preparing this presentation, I also took a notice, I also started to browse the blogs of historians. And actually in Poland, there is still active discussion regarding the legal problems, whether, for instance, this is a question whether the Warsaw could be qualified as a fortress September 1949, whether the widespread destruction of Warsaw during the September campaign was actually justifiable. And this discussion actually being led by the historians or the people with non-legal background itself. So it's definitely spotting definitely highlighting that there is some kind of intervention, necessity of legal intervention maybe, or at least legal support in this regard. Maybe intervention maybe is not a very good word in this kind of discussion. So yes, how to measure, because in 1907 there was no anti-aircraft weapon at all. It of course changes during the World War I, and even at the outbreak of the war, actually the small infantry units were able to engage with the enemy aviation. And there was one perfect article of the Richard Wiman, and he said there a question: one gun, whether the one gun was enough to actually hold the location as defended. Another thing that actually could not be technically possibly foreseen by the drafters of the Article 25 was the rise of the fighter aviation. That not only anti-aircraft artillery was changing something in measuring whether the area was defended or not, but also the fighters, the ability of the fighters to protect a certain portion of the airspace. And actually, at the end of the war, the 51 Mustang fighter was able to cover, his operational range was 1,600 kilometers. So this could lead to the conclusion that actually every town in every area in the whole battlefield zone is actually being protected. Maybe there was one exception when the Germans introduced this famous Arado R-234 jet-powered bomber that actually was able to outfly every Allied fighter and fly at the altitude beyond the range of the anti-aircraft artillery. Maybe it was creating the true meaning of defense, breaking this scheme somehow. And another misconception, in my opinion, is the problem of open towns, open city, because also there is a widespread discussion regarding whether the city could be declared open. Misconception, and I believe this is some kind of misconception and both misunderstanding of the Hague regulation, because actually this is somehow a mixture, whether it's open. So we have to ask a question, okay, so are we using the test of whether the location is defended, or we are using something more, something which is much more complicated in terms of World War II, whether there were military objectives within the location. And in my opinion, Manila, the case of Manila of 1941 is actually the perfect example, because at the time being, it was considered to be illegally attacked by the Japanese aviation. And actually, I do believe that was one of the charges during the war crimes trials, that the city was declared by the General MacArthur as open. But in March in 1945, it was called to be lawful. It was actually considered to be destroyed completely according to the international law. It was a lawful destruction because the Manila was defended, was actually turned into some kind of fortress, and actually extensive urban fighting took place in Manila in 1945. And this perspective is somehow different. Another area where, in my opinion, there's this somehow legal, that the legal experts could be somehow involved and reactivate themselves, is also which is not maybe fully legal, grounded discussion, but also some kind of philosophical, whether we could assume that the air power is a tool of revenge, reprisals, the problem of reprisals, whether the reprisals could be, in my opinion, actually indication of illegality, or maybe a confirmation of the law existing. So it is, in my opinion, of course, we cannot simply research the conduct of the air bombardments only by invoking this famous Nauilla case of 1928. Because this is, in my opinion, the reprisals sensu stricto, and if we would like to adopt the test of necessity or proportionality, the British operation, the Allied operation, it would fail on the spot, because, for instance, I made a little research regarding the quantities of bombs drops by the Luftwaffe on Poland, against Poland in September 1949. And actually, along RAF Bomber Command, they were fighting two independent Polish bomber squadrons. Actually, one of them was deploying the Lancaster bombers, and actually two small Polish independent bomber squadrons dropped, of course, in the much longer span of time, dropped almost the same number, the same tonnage of bombs of Luftwaffe against Poland in September 1949. So basically, this is only about two independent squadrons, and of course, it's showing us that completely the proportionality is way off the book. But how about the reprisal sensu largo? This is somehow the Churchill was approaching that. Okay, it's not about being, let's say, responding to the violation in a strict manner. That's actually, this bombardment is not just a reprisal sensu stricto, it's a reprisal because this is the way we are reacting to the barbarity of the Third Reich as a whole. And that's why this is reprisal. And of course, it's being also gives a reflection regarding this famous Michael Walzer example, whether the just war could be fought unjustly. And of course, another point of discussion that need to be, in my opinion, still somehow addressed, the problem of air warfare before the 1949, the air bomber in China, the air warfare in Ethiopia or in Spain. The role of the Hague Rules of Air Warfare, are they were just a proposal of the law, or they somehow transferred into hard law provisions? The role of the Martin Clause, this is also somehow confusing, because we somehow, if we don't have a clear law, we sometimes tend to turn to the Martin Clause. And when we are talking about the War II, actually none of the authors I just recalled ever consider Martin Clause as a source of obligation of the law of air bombardment, which is quite striking. And of course, the Rendulic rule, the question regarding also the international criminal law. So in conclusion, one might observe that there is some kind of turn to the history in international law. And in my opinion, this is my, of course, modest suggestion that there could be also the turn to the difficult past of the IHL, a necessary review of the past crimes and incidents. And in this regard, I think the air bombardments are a matter to be addressed with special attention. And of course, in my opinion, there is a request. I think there is a need and there is a room for lawyers to be involved in this socio-historical review, because as I said, emotions, memory, future being driven by non-legal factors. In my opinion, the lawyers should be also involved somehow. If not, in my opinion, there is one important risk. There is a risk that there could be a proliferation, if I could use some kind of, if this is a proper word to use, a proliferation of the wrong perception of international law that would in fact be contrary, that would undermine the binding power of international law, the belief that international law has something to say, that belief that this social belief also is one of the most important, also important in receiving and then of course somehow respecting the international humanitarian law. And in fact, in my opinion, the discussion regarding the air bombardments, the belief is rather that international law is ineffective. It's only for the air powers that actually had the strongest air fleet, and we should never rely on it. So it could lead to the serious problems in perceiving the international law at all. And maybe there is a room for a national-based efforts that every nation, especially nations affected by the air bombardments, could somehow create some kind of platform, create some kind of joint contribution of both lawyers and historians and address those things. All right, I've been talking for 40 minutes. I think that's more than enough. So thank you very much again for having me, and thank you for listening. And I am open for a question. Thank you very much.
Mateus, thank you very much for a very interesting and thorough presentation. I had a few questions from you based on your paper on the presentation, and then I know that Professor Shani also had a question, as well as a few others. So maybe I'll ask you my questions first, and you can respond, and then we'll open up the questions to the larger audience. You spoke about, especially earlier in the presentation, the culture of interpretation of the air bombardments in the aftermath of World War II. And I wonder if in the present moment, right, with the advent of technological developments, precision-guided weaponry, other technologies, the role of media and social media, you view the same phenomenons that you viewed in your research post post-World War II. And my second question for you has to do with the role of history in one's legal analysis. And I'm asking this as an operational lawyer, working in the context of Israel and the occupied territories, but certainly I think it's relevant for anyone working operationally. You know, you mentioned that lawyers have a tendency to forget about the historical context and focus on particular incidents. And I wanted to hear from you about what role history should play in our legal analysis. To give an example of ILOT, you know, with the various rounds of hostilities, for example, between the state of Israel and armed groups in Gaza, you know, should previous rounds of hostilities somehow play a role in our current legal analysis, in our analysis of current hostilities?
Thank you very much for those questions. So, okay, can I address it now? Okay, great.
Please, and then I think we'll open the floor to other questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. So regarding the technological developments, and are we a little bit in the same situation? I think we could draw a lot of analogy when we are, for instance, talking about the autonomous weapon system, that we are now in the middle of very in high intensity discussion mode regarding the legality of the autonomous weapon system. And in my opinion, I do have a reflection that we are just in the same position as International Committee 100 years ago during the first Hague Peace Conference of 1899. And there was the same problems regarding the aircraft itself. It wasn't the aircraft like in contemporary meaning, but it was balloons and airship, because that was the reality of the era. And somehow it was also perceived in very similar way, just like the autonomous weapon system, that, okay, this is a very effective weapon of warfare. It might have some kind of tendency to create some kind of, let's say, humanitarian harm, and maybe it would be wise to somehow limit it. But still, this rivalry between this military perspective, this belief that this is a highly sophisticated and very capable weaponry, and let's avoid generally direct responding directly. Let's not respond directly. Let's avoid any direct treaty. Let the international, the actually existing international law to deal with the problem. So in fact, that was the same stance. I think we are in the same situation nowadays in regard of autonomous weapon system, just like it was in 1899, that we were a little bit fascinated without the ability of the aircraft. We also well understanding its great military capacity, and there was also a strong humanitarian, let's say, driven sense, that because there was adoption of the declaration of the 14th Hague Declaration banning the air bombardment, and it's also striking that during the discussion, if we take a note through the preparatory works, the delegates were pointing out this is not accurate enough to be accepted as a lawful method of warfare. That was the direct observation, but nevertheless later the state said, but it could become. There was a belief, okay, it's not now on this position, it's not now in this phase, but it still has a lot of potential. Let's not let's say not block this potential. We do have some kind of issue with the network, I believe.
No, we're with you.
Okay, all right. So there was also this strong belief that it has potential, and it could become a more lawful tool of warfare. And I guess history is showing that the decision not to comprehensively regulate the air power at the beginning of the 20th century led to the tragedy of the air bombardment of the World War II. I wish that would not happen with the autonomous weapon system, for instance. But in my opinion, there could be a lot of analogy between the situation at the beginning of the 19th century and the situation that we are now in the 21st century. And as per your second question, well, of course, I would say no objection in regard that the lawyers are trying to keep up with the reality, because as I said, this has been expected from the lawyers. The society is expected that we are going to talk about what's going on now today, the contemporary situations, the contemporary issues, and also this is also a problem of somehow addressing the past, because if we somehow would like to apply the historical examples into the scholars, into the training, sometimes we need to have some kind of background corresponding with this implementation. That pure implementation in some situation could be, especially if we are talking about the pre-1977 situation, could be somehow misleading. So this still require a commentary, and in my opinion, this commentary somehow is necessary in order to actually for a better understanding. And of course, in my opinion, the history would be a great resemblance of process, what we call the progressive development of international humanitarian law. That yes, okay, maybe it was legal during the World War II, but okay, that was the change. We look at the Geneva Convention, the Protocol 1. We look at the impact of human rights in armed conflict. It's not legal anymore. And if, in my opinion, if it's presented in this way, that maybe contributes to the contemporary let's say perception of the international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We did have a few more questions. I know that Professor Shani had a question about the relationship between pre-1977 and post-1977 law. Professor Shani, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, thank you, Mateos. This was very interesting, and I'm wondering about the meta story that you are telling us, which is so you know, one can describe the history of international law as fluctuating between miserable failures and tragedies, and then reform efforts, reform stages that basically draw lessons from past failures and construct new norms, new institutions. And it's interesting because, I mean, I think your project is important, and in a way it's part of, you mentioned this historical turn, because for many years there was limited interest among international lawyers to actually go into these failures, because, you know, the failure was reflected badly on the whole discipline. And then once the new laws and institutions have been developed, then the question is, why is it relevant for a practicing lawyer to delve too deeply into an era which appears to be at least legally irrelevant at some level? But I think the dilemma here is really, where are we? Are we now after 1977, as you indicated, where you have basically you have seen eventually the response, the protocol, which introduces laws on targeting and has subsequently led to some clearer rules on air warfare. Are we still reliving, you know, the tragedy and the phase of tragedy? And you may have insinuated that maybe, you know, with new technology we'll be back into square one. Or are we in the correction phase where we are already with, you know, new institutions, rejection of total war, greater sensibility to suffering, etc. And I'm wondering how would you suggest to differentiate between these two options, whether we are in stage basically reliving the tragedy, or are we in, you know, in the redemptive phase where we have drawn lessons from the tragedy and can now approach things with, you know, with better tools? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting comments and this very interesting perspective between this redemptive phase and moving forward phase. I think, as you just mentioned, that well, the failures of the international humanitarian law were not discussed because, as you mentioned, it wasn't, let's say, appropriate way, because it was feared that if we start to analyze the failures of the international law, this could be somehow detrimental. It could create some kind of collateral damage to the contemporary perception of the international humanitarian law. So, but in my opinion, well, maybe with a sign of hope, maybe I think we are entering with the phase that we could move forward, and maybe we could say, okay, we need to address the past, even if this past is very difficult, in order to in order to be better prepared for a situation like that in the future, in order to get some lesson learned from the past, from the history of the IHL, to understand why the states were reluctant to adopt certain rules, what were the attitudes, what were the reasons why those rules were ignored, because this is, in my opinion, a knowledge of pivotal character, because we need to also understand why the rules of air bombardment, whether they were existing or not, were ignored. What was the background behind it? What was the reason? And of course, this is opening a room for much wider discussion, not only legal, but I think the social discussion, the historical discussion, the political discussion in this regard. And in my opinion, with a sign of hope, I think we are already entering the moving forward phase, that we could dealt with this issue on, let's say, I would not use the word biased, but maybe unbiased, in unbiased matter, and start discuss openly about the facts, because the historians, for instance, they do have an advantage over the lawyers, because they do have the better understanding and better access to the facts. And maybe sometimes the lawyers need to also take a greater look to the details, to the charts. For instance, in case of the Wielun bombardment, my scientific dream is to get the access to the German map, because actually the German map, which is showing the location of German units, it's not showing the location, sorry, it's not showing the location of the German units, it's actually showing the location of Polish units, which was known by the German intelligence. So important thing in case of Rendulic rule, the post factum or analyze, or antefactum, in fact, analyze in this regard. So I think there is now a good moment to maybe look with the past and said, okay, this was wrong, this was not ideal, but we are already past beyond it. We could discuss it in an open way, and we could somehow find the reasons, understand it, studied it, and maybe implement it, and maybe do better than previous generation, in fact, speaking philosophy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mateos. That brings us to the end of session 3 and the end of this evening. Thank you to all of our speakers throughout the day and our panelists. And I'd like to invite everybody to rejoin us tomorrow at 4:30 Jerusalem time, where we'll hear session 4, a mediated look at conflict situations. So thank you very much, and a good evening to all.
Thank you very much. Good evening.